Okay, well, we are at almost 5 past this morning, so probably let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's informational workshop on the safety culture assessment of Socalgas and Sempra. My name is Carolina Contreras with the Safety Policy Division of the Cpuc, and I will be your facilitator today. Can we change the slide, please? The purpose of today's workshop is to provide parties to investigation I-19-06-014 and stakeholders with an opportunity to learn about the safety culture assessment of Socalgas and Sempra directly from the independent consultants who performed the assessment. Through this workshop, we hope to promote a shared understanding about the foundations of the assessment, the work, its results, and recommendations. We are fortunate to have the Cpuc's leadership with us today. Joining us on the virtual dais are Cpuc President Reynolds and her fellow Commissioner Rechtschaffen, Commissioner Shiroma, and Commissioner Hauk. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the next slide, thank you. In terms of format for today's workshop, we will start with opening remarks from the dais, followed by a brief background on this proceeding. We will then launch into TUIC's presentation of its report and assessment of Socalgas and Sempra. The morning presentation will address the safety culture concept, the methodology, and the findings of the assessment, while the afternoon session will address the recommendations. We are scheduled to break for lunch at 12 p.m. and will reconvene at 1 p.m. There will be 2 Q&A sessions in the afternoon intended for parties and stakeholders to ask questions of TUIC or staff. This first will be held when we reconvene from lunch break and is intended to address any questions related to the material presented up until that point of the presentation. We will then continue with TUIC's presentation of its recommendations, followed by a short stretch break before returning for the second Q&A session. We will then walk through the next steps and hold informal public comments. We are scheduled to conclude today's workshop at 4:20 p.m. Can we go to the next slide? To effectively use everyone's time, I'd like to emphasize that there are 2 different types of participation today. The first are the Q&A sessions, which are designed for parties to ask questions from TUIC about the assessment. There will be 2 Q&A sessions spaced throughout the presentation so that questions can be addressed as the presentation content progresses. The second is dedicated time for informal public comment or statements at the end of the agenda. So if you're a party and have a question, please use the Q&A time. If you have a public comment or statement, please use the informal public comment session to do so. These are all informal and are not part of the record of the proceeding. Please make note of these 2 different options so you are heard at the appropriate time. Also, please keep in mind that we may not get to everybody today, but we will definitely be doing our best to get as many questions and comments as is possible. Can we go to the next slide, please? So you may participate via WebEx or phone if you have a verbal question and comment. WebEx participants can ask a question or provide comment by opening the participants menu on the right side of the WebEx window and clicking the raise hand icon that appears in the lower right-hand corner of the participants menu. When the facilitator calls your name to speak, confirm that your microphone is unmuted by checking its status in the bottom center of your WebEx window and provide your comment. English-speaking participants listening by phone who wish to ask a question or provide a public comment can unmute their phones and dial *3, which will alert our technical host. Telephone listeners are only identifiable to us by the first 6 digits of their phone number, starting with their area code. Please make note of those 6 digits and listen out for them when waiting to speak. Spanish language participants listening by phone who wish to provide a public comment can unmute their phones and dial *1, which will alert our operator and interpreter when the interpreter prompts you. Please provide your comment 1 sentence at a time so your comment can be translated into English. Spanish speakers will be allocated extra time for translation of their comments. We will try to monitor the chat. We can go to the next slide, please. We will try to monitor the chat and weave your questions into the discussion if possible, but just bear in mind that it may not be the priority throughout the presentation, so we may not get to it right away. However, we will keep note of your questions, and if possible, after workshop, we will do our best to address. But, we will try to do what we can at the workshop. Finally, if members of the public prefer to submit formal written comments, they may do so online via the docket proceeding at any time. A link to the docket is included in the agenda and on the presentation slides, which will also be made available. Can we go ahead to the next slide? We have some additional reminders for you. This workshop will be recorded and the material will be made available for future watching. For the Q&A sessions, we ask that parties and stakeholders please keep your questions to approximately 1 minute so that we may include as many interested parties as possible. I may prompt you to wrap up your question depending on how many participants have questions. Again, we will hold a public comment session at the end of today's agenda at approximately 3:50 p.m. We ask that you state your name and organization when posing your question or making your comment. Finally, no decisions are being made and no actions will be taken today. This will be an open informational venue to learn and further your understanding of the safety culture assessment performed on Socalgas and Sempra. We can go ahead to the next slide. So I will now turn it over to Commissioner Rechtschaffen for some opening remarks. Commissioner Rechtschaffen.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Carolina, and welcome everybody. Welcome to my fellow commissioners. I want to thank you, Carolina, also for all your extremely hard work in leading up to today's workshops. For the commissioners and other parties, this is the beginning. Today's the beginning of this proceeding, but our team has been very hard at work on this for over a year. And I should really point out that that's been quite challenging to bring on a consultant, have the consultant do the kind of in-depth work with the utility that it's done, and do this during a pandemic. So it's quite an achievement, and I thank you guys very, very much. As you know, today's workshop is part of an investigation into the safety culture of both Socalgas and Sempra that we opened in 2019. And we opened it after a series of safety incidents on the gas system that's operated and maintained by Socalgas, quite a number over a period of years. We did this in parallel and at the same time that we opened our enforcement investigation into Socalgas's role in the leak at the Aliso Canyon storage facility. These are separate proceedings. They're separate on separate tracks, different purposes. Judge Klein will say more about these in a little bit. Just at a very, very high level, and we will hear this today, a strong safety culture is really critical in our regulatory regime. It's the most comprehensive and the most effective measure that utilities can implement. It's really the best investment we can make and utilities can make to prevent harm. It's the best preventative measure to prevent harm to utility workers, to the public, to contractors. We have recently opened a broader safety culture rulemaking, and in that we're trying to institutionalize safety culture assessments for all of our regulated energy utilities. So that's a very important initiative for the commission-wide. We've been developing and growing our focus on safety culture for a number of years, really for most of the last decade. I think we started with the Commission's enhanced focus on safety after the 2010 gas line explosion in San Bruno, and we've been continuing to sharpen our focus since then, and these proceedings are the logical outgrowth of that effort. It's not an easy effort. It's challenging. Understanding the safety culture, and in particular, and we'll hear more today, implementing organizational changes to implement the safety culture take a lot of time. They take attentions. They take humility. They take curiosity. Doing this requires leaders to really understand how an organization is organized, how it's functioning, and how this organization and its process and its behaviors contribute to safety performance. So to be successful, we need that kind of commitment and vigilance and attention from Socalgas and its leaders, and we also need it from ourselves as the supervisory regulatory authority over Socalgas. I have been briefed before on 2EC's report, but I'm still digesting it. There's a tremendous amount of useful material in it. I'll be listening intently today to gain a deeper understanding. As Carolina says, it's a learning experience for all of us. There's some sobering observations in the report you'll hear about. Also some encouraging examples of they will hear participants, including the leadership and board members, being engaged and open. So there's a lot for us to work through. I want to thank 2EC for their work thus far, and again, especially accomplishing what they did in managing the workload during this pandemic. With that, I'll turn it back to Carolina.
Thank you, Commissioner Rechtschaffen. I would like to check with President Reynolds if you have any open remarks you'd like to share.
Thank you, Carolina. Just briefly, I wanted to welcome all the participants in the workshop today. Really pleased that you are joining us, and thank you to Commissioner Rechtschaffen for his opening remarks. I did just want to briefly reiterate a couple of the points we made. The first being that the importance of a healthy safety culture. This really is critically important to prevention, and that is, of course, where we want to be in preventing incidents rather than being reactive to them. And then in addition to highlighting the importance, also recognizing that safety culture is one of the most difficult things to evaluate, and maybe even harder to change once we identify problems. So I really appreciate the framework used in the report that we'll be talking about today. I'm looking forward to hearing more from the contractor, and looking forward to hearing about areas where attention is needed, and really appreciate Commissioner Rechtschaffen for his leadership in this proceeding, as well as staff and all the hard work that has already been done. With that, I will turn it over back to you, Carolina.
Carolina, you're muted.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Joe. Commissioner Shiroma, would you like to share some opening remarks with us?
Yes. Thank you, Carolina. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Commissioner Rechtschaffen and everyone on the safety policy team who worked on assuring that this report was completed. Thank you to Evolving Energy Consortium for your work and for being here today to share with us your important findings. It is essential and important that we collectively focus on continuous improvement in safety together, and keep in mind that safety needs to be a perpetual value, a core part of a company culture, both internally and externally, for management and staff, and a keen awareness of the impact on customers and neighbors. I look forward to today's presentation and the questions and discussions on what our next steps need to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Shiroma. Commissioner Hauk, if you have any remarks, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Carolina. I also want to thank Commissioner Rechtschaffen for his leadership on this important matter. I want to thank you, Carolina, and the Commission safety policy staff for all of their work in this proceeding and preparing for today's workshop, as well as 2EC for their participation in presentation that we're going to hear today. Our regulatory mandate is to ensure that Socalgas and Sempra provide safe, reliable, and affordable service with minimal risk to workers, contractors, and the public. This report finds substantial systematic issues with Sempra and Socalgas's safety culture. These findings are concerning, and I look forward to hearing more about 2EC's recommendations and how the utilities can improve their safety outcomes. Additionally, I am concerned about the number of safety proceedings that the commission and the safety staff are engaged in, and I think that this assessment here is a very important first step in addressing how we can move forward and look at safety culture overall for the utilities, and also the comments regarding the commission looking at its safety culture. I hope that the lessons learned in this proceeding can inform our other safety culture assessments that we're engaging in, including the safety culture rulemaking that Commissioner Rechtschaffen mentioned. I think these are all critical and important processes that we can hopefully maximize the resources in the most productive and efficient way through learning from presentations such as what we're going to hear today. And I again just want to thank Commissioner Rechtschaffen for taking this on and his leadership in this matter, as well as the safety policy team. And I look forward to hearing more about today's presentation. And with that, we'll conclude my remarks.
Thank you, Commissioner Haug, and thank you, commissioners, for the thoughtful opening remarks. I will now turn it to ALJ Klein for some background on this proceeding. ALJ Klein, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Carolina. Good morning. My name is Zita Klein, and I am the administrative law judge assigned to this proceeding. Today, I'm going to offer some background on this proceeding and guidance for participation at today's workshop. In response to the uncontrolled release of natural gas at the Aliso Canyon Storage Facility from October 23, 2015 to February 11, 2016, the Commission opened 2 proceedings. This proceeding was opened to review Southern California Gas Company and its parent company, Sempra Energy's safety culture. The first phase of this proceeding included a study conducted by 2EC and overseen by the Commission's Safety Policy Division, which looked at the safety-related activities and attitudes of Southern California Gas Company and Sempra Energy during the 2020 to 2021 period. The first phase of this proceeding concluded with the completion of a safety culture study. The second phase of this proceeding focuses on the safety culture study report, with the goal of communication and collaboration among parties to develop a common understanding of the report's results and recommendation. In this second phase, the Commission may consider revising existing orders and conditions or impose new ones on Southern California Gas Company or Sempra Energy as necessary and appropriate to optimize public utility resources and the operational and safety performance record, and to promote a high-functioning safety culture that promotes continuous safety improvement. This second phase will not focus on specific past safety incidents, nor will it become a venue in which to duplicate or revisit questions already within the scope of other existing proceedings. Therefore, we remind the participants that this phase of the proceeding, and more specifically this workshop, will focus on constructive, forward-looking actions intended to improve the safety of Southern California Gas Company and Sempra Energy in the future. Public participation is encouraged, and there will be an opportunity for questions, discussion, and public comment on the 2EC Safety Culture Report in the latter half of this workshop. The Commission is also conducting a formal investigation to consider whether Southern California Gas Company or Sempra Energy violated any provision of the Public Utility Code or other state or federal law, rule, order, or decision related to the uncontrolled release of natural gas at the Aliso Canyon Storage Facility in a separate proceeding as mentioned by Commissioner Rechtschaffen. That proceeding is Investigation 19-06-014. That is an adjudicatory proceeding, and the ex parte restrictions for that proceeding will be enforced at today's workshop. The Commission is accepting public comments on I-19-06-014, the backwards-looking investigation, through the Public Comment tab on the docket card of that proceeding. Please contact the Public Advisor's Office if you need any further assistance with participation in either proceeding. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray J. Klein. We will now hear from a presentation from Evolving Energy Consortium on their safety culture assessment of Socalgas and Sempra. Welcome to EC team. I'm very happy to have you here with us today. I will now turn it over to Ms. Monica Hag, CEO of 2EC. Welcome, Ms. Hag.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Carolina and the commissioners, for having this opportunity to share the 2EC's results of the safety culture assessment. We can put on the slides so we can start the presentation and make the best use of the time. Thank you. So, first of all, I would like to say thank you to everyone who have been collaborating.
Monica, could you speak up a little bit? Monica?
Sure.
Would you?
Okay.
Could you speak a little louder?
Okay, I'll speak louder. Is it enough?
Thank you.
Do you hear me? Well, okay. Thank you, Joe. Okay, so good morning and thank you, everyone. So I would like to start the presentation, and you can go to the next slide, please. So first, next slide, please. Can we take the next slide? Thank you. So thank you, that slide, thank you. So I want to start to say thank you to everyone that's been involved to make this possible, and thank you, Commissioner Rashafen, for sharing that it has been a different experience for us doing this during a pandemic. We learned a lot, and then we also learned how to overcome challenges together in a very good way, I think. My name is Monica Hage, and I am the CEO of the 2EC, the Evolving Energy Consortium. And I want to present a little bit about myself and then the rest of the team. And I've been very happy to have a competent and very strong team for this assessment. My background is that I am a social psychologist, but I'm also an engineer in automation and production. I have over 18 years about practical work in leadership and culture for safety. And the main part of those years have been in an international arena. I've been employed by the International Atomic Energy Agency as a safety culture expert. That means that I've been part of evolving publications, working with experts around the world, delivering different types of work. And part of that have been to do safety culture assessments in many countries. And that work have also been continued as part of the 2EC work. And one thing that I'm especially proud of is that I was the technical lead for the IEA report, trying to understand why the Fukushima accident happened from a safety culture and a leadership perspective. So this is a little bit about me. I also have experience from aviation, and I also been working with the oil and gas industry and other organizations that needs to prioritize safety. And the technical project lead for this assessment has been Sonia Haber. So I give it over to Sonia to present herself and short about her background.
Thank you, Monica. Good morning, everybody. And thank you also to the commissioners and the CPUC and all of the parties that supported this effort. I was the technical team lead for this assessment. I have a PhD in psychology, and I have been working in the area of organizational safety culture for over 35 years. I've conducted these types of assessments in over 60 different types of organizations, both domestically and internationally, including regulatory agencies as well as operational facilities, also across several industries. I worked with Monica on the work regarding Fukushima through the International Atomic Energy Agency, and I continue to be very passionate and interested in the area of safety and safety performance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I will give over to Rod Walker, our industry expert, to be part of the team.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you to all for this opportunity today. My name is Rod Walker. I have 36 years of energy industry, it's hard to say, experience primarily in the utility industry. 18 years, half of it spent with Atlanta Gas Light, which is now Southern Company Gas, and a variety of engineering, management, operations roles, as well as the general manager of 2 utilities in Georgia, covering all aspects of running a utility. The other 18 years of that 36 was spent in consulting. I've worked for Black & Veatch, Leidos, and now my own firm for the last 5 years, focusing on due diligence primarily of during merger and acquisition assessments, but also expert witness type work in several jurisdictions throughout the country. Thank you.
Monica, I believe you're muted.
Okay, sorry. Over to you, Sandy.
Okay. Thank you so much, and it's very nice to be here. Happy to have been able to engage in this project. I've had over 40 years of experience conducting organizational culture analyses and designing and implementing change projects across a number of industries, across a number of countries. I started working with Monica and Sonia sometime before the Fukushima accident, but of course worked then directly with them, with the company Cpuc as an owner of the facility itself. Most of our work has been, of course, trying to understand how safety culture actually functions in these contexts, and of course to design the kind of organizational change processes that would enhance the functioning of those organizations. I have a PhD, and my PhD focuses in an interdisciplinary way across interaction processes and decision-making within organizations. I've done a lot of work for a lot of different kinds of agencies, and I've written a number of white paper reports and others that analyzes stakeholders' involvements in collaborative decision-making across these industries as they try to deal with the kind of challenges that can take place in the contemporary world. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. And over to you, Mark Fleming.
Everyone, again, thank you for joining us today for this presentation of the work we've been doing over the last 2 years. My background is I'm a professor of psychology. I've been working with safety culture and safety critical industries for over 25 years. I started with the offshore oil and gas industry in Europe, and more recently have worked with nuclear power, gas pipelines, energy sector in general. Again, the work I do is helping organizations understand and improve their safety culture. I also provide guidance and support to regulators in North America and internationally about the ways to promote a continuous improvement in safety culture. I was also the first professor of safety culture, which was a 5-year term working on improvement strategies around safety culture. So thank you very much for the time that we're going to get spent today, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mark. And then we also have a quality assessor that was performed by Earl Carnes, and we were very happy to have him helping us to do an independent quality assurance of the work we've done. Earl Carnes have been working over 45 years in both private and governmental agencies, and he's been working in the same area as the rest of us in improving safety and performance and leadership and safety culture. He is retired and formerly was the advisor of high reliability and safety culture of the U.S. Department of Energy, the DOE. And so that was the team that was performing the work. And you could go to the next slide now. So we want to talk a little bit first about culture and why this is so important and close to all our hearts. And we're going to do it a little bit rather quick, but just to set the scene about how we perceive and think around culture, because this is a bit of an intangible concept and a little bit, as was mentioned by the commissioners, that is a little bit difficult to assess and to work with, because it's not something that is an object that we can touch and directly see. So we can go to the next slide. There are many definitions about culture, and definitions are generally emphasizing two sides. And one side, click, thank you, is the culture as pattern of behaviors or interactions. Sometimes you have heard that culture is the way we do things around here. This is one kind of how we can understand culture and define it. And the other one is, if you click, thank you, is about culture as a systems of thoughts, how we believe, how we value, how we perceive and assume things. That is another way. Our approach has been to look at both of those. And if you go to the next slide, we will present for you Professor Edgar Scheim's model. Here is demonstrated by an iceberg. We like this model because it gives culture a little bit more of a tangible way of thinking and organize our thoughts around culture, that it has these three levels. The top of the iceberg is the thing that we could see, which is the behaviors, the artifacts, the physical manifestations, like that the office, the biggest office with the nicest room, with a big view and so on, is usually the CEO or the Director General's office, the physical artifacts. But these are shaped by values that is beneath the surface, how we value and how we believe and how we think things should be. And the deepest part of the culture is the basic assumptions. Those are usually not known by us because it's just there, but they have an important way of how we understand the reality and also how it shapes our values and also our behaviors and how we design systems and so on. So giving you an example of how this can work is that if you have an assumption that you could, if you have safety as a system that you just create procedures and people need to follow these procedures and adhere to them, then everything will be okay. If a manager have that assumption and see someone not following the procedure, they probably will have a conversation more like, this is your first warning. You need to follow the procedure, otherwise you're out of here. If the manager instead have another assumptions about safety and know that safety has many different factors that contribute to safety, and if he or she sees somebody working and not following the procedure, they might probably have another way to approach and behave, and ask questions, explorative questions, to understand why the person is breaking the rule or not following the rules, because maybe there are stress factors, maybe there's a lack of training, understanding, and other things, and that information is important to improve the system. So these different assumptions will shape how we are behaving and acting together, and that is an important part of the safety and the culture, of course. We can go to the next slide. So there is a dynamic of these three levels. You could think about it like there is a autopilot, the things we just do and we do it over and over again. So it starts to be the norm, the way we socialize, the way we just do the work. That is like a cogwheel of an organizational behavior. But the deepest part of the culture, as said, is the assumption. And we can understand that as the engine that is driving these behaviors. And doing an assessment, it's important that we come all the way to understand the assumptions, how we understand safety and reality. So these three levels, I think, helps us to understand and make it more tangible and organize our thinking around safety culture. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. There are unique features of safety culture, the safety culture assessment methodology that we have used. And I want to tell you what those are. So we can go to the next slide, please. We are pretty strict with dividing a descriptive approach and divide it away from a normative approach. Descriptive means that we try to understand what is based on data and theory of culture. In practice, this meant that when we were talking with people, we were writing what people were saying, not what we thought they said or concluded what I said or interpreted what I said. Because if we do that, we start to color and maybe not knowing that we could color it with our subjectivity. And we don't want that. So we want to be very strictly describing what we see, what we heard, and so on. So our notes were very factually based in that sense of what people said, and so on. The normative part of the assessment comes later on, and I will soon show you what that looks like in the process. The normative is how it should be, because we know from a lot of research and experience what safety, how it should look like when it is a healthy safety culture. For our assessment, we have used the US NRC's, the Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner in the US, and the IMPO safety culture framework. So we want to make you aware that this methodology is having this unique feature that we make a big difference between what is descriptive and what is normative. And we can go to the next slide. So I will show you a little bit about the process and how it looked like. So the biggest chunk you could see here is the descriptive part. So we have gathered interview data and dragged out facts from the notes that we have written, what people actually said. And as I said, not what we concluded them to say. It needs to be very factual. And then we have created themes or conclusions. And we have done the same for each and every data set. So we used survey, we did the same with the culture of facts, and then the conclusion. We did focus group, we dragged out the cultural facts and then the themes and the conclusions on that. The same with the document reviews that we did and the observations that we also performed. And we keep them all separated. So when we've been working with the interview data, we kept that separated from the survey or the focus group, just to ensure that we don't start to bias the results and start to do a mixture between all those different data sets and maybe start to color it into a certain direction. Oh, maybe this is like that. And then you just find confirmation in the data. And that wouldn't help to make a good assessment, which is objective and descriptive. So each of these data sets are kept in separation. And when we had all the conclusions for each data set, then we have done an overarching analysis to see what themes is coming out. And you will soon hear Sonia presenting the 4 overarching themes, which were descriptive. Describing what we said. We are not saying if it was something what was strong or something that was weak. We just describe what we have seen. And then the last part is we have taken then the normative framework, as I said, from the US NRC, and info and made a comparison. What is the strength that we have found here in the themes, and what are the things that could be improved? And we can go to the next slide and look at what this framework looked like. We use this framework because we think that it is a comprehensive framework, it's internationally recognized, and it has and it's neat because it have 10 different traits, as you see here: leadership and safety, values and actions, problem identification and resolution, personal accountability, work processes, continuous learning, environment for raising concern, effective safety communication, respect for work environment and questioning attitude, and decision making. These are the 10 traits for a healthy safety culture. So this is what we have compared our work with. And this, what also is neat and nice with this framework, because it's used both for the regulator and the operators. So that is also a strength with this. There is also a link here, as you see, if you want to see more and learn more about this normative framework. Okay, next slide, please. So as I said, we took all the data we gathered and the overarching themes and compared them with these 10 traits. So that is how the process have worked and functioned. Okay, and the next slide, please. So we was busy doing 64 interviews. We performed 84 focus groups. So we interacted with about over 700 people. And the document review is comprehensive. If you look at in our report, you will see pages and pages of the documents that we reviewed from a culture perspective. We also performed about 75 observations on work sites, and we went to many different work sites and places in South California to see where work is actually was done. We also been observing different meetings and other workplaces. We also have done a safety culture perception survey, as mentioned, and we had Socalgas. We had a good response rate of 85%. Socalgas has been very instrumental and helpful in helping us to do all this work, and also to help us to get those good response rates. Sempra the same, we had also good response rate on 79%. But contractors, we were not as successful. We only had 56% in the response rate. And I want to take the opportunity to thank Socalgas and Sempra for helping us in so many different ways to make this, because as you could see, it's a huge logistic work to get all this working well. So we could have done this independent safety culture assessment during the pandemic. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So we want to say just a few words also about why we think this is so important to do this kind of assessment. It is really about finding and building awareness about what is driving this cogwheel of organizational behavior, and to explore what is beneath the surface and what are the assumptions that is the engine that drives this. So we can, in a proactive way, find weaknesses, but also, as important, strengths that we could build from. And culture is not black or white. Culture has many facets. So it's important to use a good methodology as presented, so we can capture information enough to do a good assessment that is helpful, so we can continue to learn and enhance the leadership, the culture for safety. So that was short about the background about culture and about the methodology. So now I will ask you to show us the next slide, and I will give it over to Sonia, who will present the assessment results. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Monica. Before we get into the actual results, I would just like to say a few words to remind you of what you're going to see and what it represents. I think the first thing that you have to remember that we described is that we are trying to understand the perceptions, the attitudes, and the values of the members of the organization and how that relates to safety performance. So cultural facts, as Monica was describing, are things that we heard from people, things we have observed, things that we read, but through the lenses of culture, the values, attitudes, and belief. And it's important to remember that. This is not a technical assessment. The details that you see will be somewhat different than what you're probably used to. In addition, I think that you need to remember as we go through this that the traits that Monica described in the normative framework have attributes associated with them. What we mean by that is that there are behaviors that help us understand whether or not there is an absence or presence of that trait. So we can look for certain types of things and see if the organization demonstrates those behaviors. Having said that, let's get into the results. May I have the next slide, please? As Monica said, we took all these cultural facts and we tried to describe an image of the culture. And what emerged were 4 overarching themes that helped us to understand through description of all of the facts that we collected. And you can imagine using the 5 methods and the number of interviews and focus groups and observations, we literally had thousands of facts to sort through. The first theme that came out, which is probably the most predominant, was that safety is most often perceived as personnel safety. And in this part of the presentation, it's not my job to draw the conclusions or the analysis. I'm going to present to you some of the observations that we used that led to that theme, and the traits that we then used in the normative analysis to understand the absence or presence of those traits related to that theme. Theme 2 was that safety and risk are perceived as achieved by compliance. And we'll talk a little bit about the different mindsets and culture around how safety is perceived. The third theme is resources are needed to shape a healthy safety culture. And the fourth theme is that learning and safety improvement requires an integrated management system. And you will note that these themes are still in a very descriptive mode. We really have not yet drawn an evaluation or judgment about the presence or absence of these themes in Socalgas and Sempra Energy. That becomes the job of the normative analysis. Next slide, please. As Monica showed you, and just to remind you, because you'll see them on the slides that I will present, the normative safety culture framework that we use to assess whether or not a healthy safety culture exists were the 10 traits that Monica identified that are presented on the screen, and the framework, as she described, used by the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but internationally recognized. I should also mention that API, the American Petroleum Institute, is using this in guidance for its Center for Offshore Safety as well. Next slide, please. So Monica showed you the Iceberg model with the 3 levels of culture described by Edgar Schein, and the notion of it being kind of an engine that drives the behaviors and the artifacts that we see. So perceptions are reality, and the behaviors that people exhibit and the perceptions that they express often drive their behavior. And so you are looking at the things that this engine is really composed of. So that's why the findings that you'll see, which we are calling cultural facts, are so important in understanding the safety culture of an organization. The slides that follow are in the following structure, and I just want to give you the structure so it'll be a little bit easier to go through. At the top of the slide will be the overarching theme, one of 4 that we just described to you. And then the normative traits will be there with a description of the definition as used by the framework of what that normative trait means. And then for each of the traits, you will see an example of positive observations and examples of areas in need of attention. Now, obviously, in the time allotted for this workshop, we cannot go through all of the observations. But as you know, the report has been made public, and all of the observations are presented in the report. And all of the observations mean those that we heard consistently or observed consistently through the assessment. Any one individual or particular observation does not appear as a bullet or conclusion in this assessment. Remember, we're trying to describe a culture of an organization, not any individual's particular bias. Now, of course, if you do have a lot of individual biases, that's an element of culture. But we want to say that the bullets that you see are represented by multiple facts, not a single fact. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get into the first theme. Safety is most often perceived as personnel safety. The normative trait here that we looked at was leadership safety values and actions. That's the first one on the list of 10, if you recall. And the definition is that leaders demonstrate a commitment to safety in their decisions and behavior. And a couple of positive examples, and then a couple of areas in need of attention. In the positive vein, personnel safety is widely perceived to be a value in the organization, and this is across both Socalgas and Sempra. And the response to COVID-19 was frequently cited as a positive example of how the organization exhibited this value. The second positive observation is that the Sempra governance model of Socalgas is perceived to ensure that safety is constantly scrutinized through a variety of monitoring techniques. And in the report, you will see the addition of safety advisory committees and outside organizations that help to ensure that safety is scrutinized in an oversight and governance way. In terms of areas in need of attention, as it relates to this theme, which safety is most often perceived as personnel safety, public safety and security as examples were seldom recognized in the conversation around safety. That's not to say that the organizations don't have things related to public safety and security, but with respect to the perceptions of individuals, personnel safety was often the topic of conversation. Socalgas does not use an integrated and systematic process for evaluating and implementing change so that all aspects of safety are considered. A healthy safety culture requires that all types of safety be considered in all changes and processes in the organization. And an integrated management system, and we will talk about this a little bit later, is one way to help. But there are other ways as well, and we did not see evidence of this integrated and systematic process for looking at all types of safety in changes across the organization. Next slide, please. The second normative trait associated with this first theme is personal accountability. And the definition of that is that all individuals take personal responsibility for safety. A couple of positive observations were that interviewees indicated that they understand and are trained to take a serious responsibility about their personal safety and how it impacts the family, the community, and other workers at Socalgas. That was something that was clearly expressed to us throughout the assessment. The second positive observation was that individuals identified that the union often provides checks and balances, and that shop stewards will hold frontline supervisors responsible for personnel safety. In terms of areas in need of attention with respect to personal accountability, interviewees expressed the perception that a double standard exists around accountability in Socalgas. And as we talk about later, this is sometimes a disconnect between different levels in the organization. One standard is applied to one level and another to a different organizational level. The second area in need of attention is that supplemental personnel or contractors do not always understand and/or practice expected behaviors and actions. There were observations and descriptions of inconsistent behavior on the part of contractors with respect to the types of policies and procedures required of Socalgas employees. Next slide, please. The third normative trait for this theme is decision-making. And the definition is that decisions that support or affect safety are systematic, rigorous, and thorough. In terms of positive observations, the safety perception survey that we administered to all the employees at Socalgas and as Sempra, respondents had positive perceptions about decision-making in both the Socalgas and Sempra organizations. The second bullet refers to the fact that decisions made to protect personnel during COVID-19 have been praised by many of the interviewees, which of course relates to the first one that we talked about in leadership, describing that safety is a value throughout the organization. However, again, the emphasis here is on personal safety. The second, the bullets in terms of areas in need of attention for this trait. The first is that observations and interviewees indicated that a consistent and systematic approach to decision-making, where risk insights are incorporated as appropriate, is frequently not implemented. And this goes back to the notion of having kind of an integrated approach or a system with respect to how you can think about safety as well as the relationship to risk. The second area in need of attention identified here is that respondents to the survey who were identified as union members had fewer positive perceptions about decision-making than non-union respondents. All of these data, by the way, are in the report, either in the main body of the report or in the appendix of the report. Next slide, please. Theme number 2. Safety and risk are perceived as achieved by compliance. And I want to just take a minute to explain that when an organization goes through different phases, if you will, there are 3 phases that we like to think about. And the first is a compliance phase. The second, as it moves through this continuum, is a performance phase. And the third is a systemic phase. And it's important to talk about this now because it will come up later. In the compliance phase, the organization basically is addressing safety through the requirements, let's say, of a regulator in this case. And that its mindset is really to manage safety through just meeting requirements. As it moves through to performance phase, it starts understanding some of the metrics and measures it can use to manage safety. And then finally, as you get through to a systemic phase, the organization has integrated all kinds of safety, both through compliance and performance, to basically have safety as a way of doing business. And it becomes very internalized and systemic throughout the organization. So safety and risk are perceived as achieved by compliance is the second theme, given the information that we collected. And the first trait here is questioning attitude. Individuals avoid complacency and continuously challenge existing conditions and activities in order to identify discrepancies that might result in error or inappropriate action. That is the definition that is used in the normative framework. When we look at our facts, we come up with positive observations, the first being that interviewees indicated that the Sempra board uses its external safety advisory board to ask probing questions to understand the implications and consequences on safety of proposed activities. So that would help in terms of this questioning attitude. The second positive observation is that Stop the Job is frequently identified by interviewees as a tool that allows them to stop work activities when confronted with an unexpected condition, communicate with their supervisors, and then resolve the condition prior to continuing work activities. We did hear fairly consistently throughout the organization in Socalgas about Stop the Job. Areas in need of attention, however, the first bullet, the consistent focus by interviewees in Socalgas and Sempra on the very positive perceptions and actions around personnel safety, while attributing the job of risk assessment to somebody else or someone else's job, contribute to the lack of a questioning attitude. And let me take a minute to explain this. As we said in the first theme, personnel safety seems to be the overriding view that was expressed by interviewees and by our observations during the assessment. There have been a lot of positive actions and behaviors in personnel safety throughout Socalgas and Sempra. And what this does is essentially sometimes leads to some type of complacency or non-questioning attitude around maybe other aspects of safety, because people believe that safety is being well managed and well understood. And the point that the team wants to make is that, in fact, when you don't view safety comprehensively, then that type of complacency could lead you to miss other areas that could be problematic in safety. And here, we're saying that the job of risk assessment, which is a piece of safety, was typically assigned to somebody else. So I can think about personnel safety, but risk assessment, or that is somebody else's job. And that doesn't help everybody to question perhaps all elements of safety. The second bullet here is that interviewees across various locations in Socalgas question the complacency exhibited by some leadership when gas smells are identified. That sometimes that noise, the background noise, becomes normal, and we become sometimes complacent to that. And so some interviewees expressed some concern about that. Next slide, please. The second trait for this theme of safety and risk are perceived as achieved by compliance is the normative trait is environment for raising concerns. A safety-conscious work environment, also known as SQE, for those of you familiar in the nuclear industry, this is a very big area, is maintained where personnel feel free to raise safety concerns without the fear of retaliation, intimidation, harassment, or discrimination. And that can take various forms. It can be very subtle. It doesn't have to be most significant, but if people believe there is that type of environment, that they cannot raise concerns because they might in some way be retaliated, intimidated, or harassed, then you don't have a healthy safety culture or a healthy environment for raising concerns. Two positive observations here were that interviewees reported that few individuals were ever fired for self-reporting noncompliance. So if somebody didn't comply or perhaps made an error, rarely could they identify a case where that employee would be terminated. The second positive was that interviewees indicated that the board meetings have an open climate for discussion. In terms of areas in need of attention, some Socalgas interviewees indicated feeling inhibited to raise safety concerns because of fear of embarrassment or harassment by supervision. And in that case, we described in the report some examples where people felt that if they did raise a concern about safety, they might not be well received by their supervision or in some cases their colleagues. The second area in need of attention is that for Sempra respondents on the safety perception survey, scores were less positive in response to the statement that criticism is encouraged and in the ability to challenge decisions. In other words, among the Sempra survey respondents, the idea was that the lowest scoring statement was about this criticism being encouraged and the ability to challenge decisions. So that is indicative, at least in some percentage of the population, of perhaps some inhibition to raise safety concerns. Next slide, please. The next trait with respect to this theme is respectful work environment. And it's defined as the fact that trust and respect permeate the organization. Positive observations included indications that Socalgas customer service technicians, field technicians, and inspectors were very courteous to customers and respectful of their property. And the team observed this on multiple occasions in the field. The second positive observation was that most interviewees described Socalgas as a good company with good compensation and good employees. And there was clearly a description of a family atmosphere and a good company from many of the people that we spoke with. In terms of areas in need of attention, Socalgas interviewees indicated that trust is not fostered among many individuals and work groups across the organization. And when we get to the conclusions, we can say that some of this is because Socalgas is a very siloed organization. And what we mean by that is that each group, be it functional or sometimes at an organizational level, is very much not working in a collaborative or teamwork position with other groups. And so you do not foster trust if you don't really work together and establish teamwork across the organization. Second area in need of attention is that interviewees at all organizational levels in Socalgas recognize the existence of silos and the need to build better collaboration and interaction between groups. It's not something that we identified to the organization. It's something that they self-identified, but have not yet been able to manage to change that. Next slide, please. The third overarching theme out of the four that we presented is that resources are needed to promote a healthy safety culture. The first normative trait out of the framework here is work processes. And the definition defined by the framework is that the process of planning and controlling work activities is implemented so that safety is maintained. On the positive side, some senior management interviewees perceive that the Safety Enforcement Division of the CPUC trusts them and indicates that the CPUC asks them for engineering advice. So there's the notion here that there is a positive relationship between SED and Socalgas and, well, primarily Socalgas among senior management interviewees. The second positive observation was the contractor interviewees indicated that they do use Socalgas procedures. In terms of areas in need of attention, the perception of many Socalgas interviewees is that management does not ensure that staffing levels are consistent with the demands related to maintaining safety and reliability. This was something that was fairly consistent across the Socalgas organization. And staffing here refers to several aspects, namely, in some cases, it could be the number of staff. In some cases, it could be the experience of the staff, be the allocation of the staff. But staffing was consistently identified as an issue. Interviewees indicated that certain work processes do not always include the identification and management of risk commensurate to the work. And so sometimes there was work identified and the potential of risk and how it would be managed, not necessarily a hazard or a safety hazard, but risk to the system or to some other part of the enterprise was not always identified in developing this work. Next slide, please. The next trait for this third theme is effective safety communication, and it's defined as communication maintaining a focus on safety. On the positive side, leaders frequently communicate and reinforce the expectation that safety is the organization's priority. And we mentioned in the first theme that this was true under the leadership, safety, values, and actions. However, this expectation around safety, again, is focused largely on personnel safety. The second bullet is that executive interviewees from Sempra and Socalgas describe direct communication, healthy debate in their boardrooms to create a culture that can trickle down into their organizations. And I think as we talk about some conclusions, this is the perception at the executive level. It's not clear that this is the perception in other levels in the organization, or that in fact that culture does trickle down into the lower levels of the organization. Areas in need of attention. The first bullet here is that the documentation that we reviewed did not include information regarding processes surrounding public input on safety and environmental issues. And what we mean here, to be very specific, is there is no formal process for public input on safety and environmental. There are some committees, there are informal processes, the organization is in touch with the community, but in the documentation, we did not find any formal processes surrounding such input on that type of safety. The second bullet is that the free flow of information openly and candidly, both up and down and across the organization and with external stakeholders, is not perceived at all levels of the Socalgas organization. Communication does not flow freely up the organization, and there's difficulty, as we said before in the other bullet, that it didn't always go down into the organization. And the silo effect also inhibits it across the organization. Next slide, please. The fourth theme, the fourth and final overarching theme that we'll talk about is learning and safety improvement requires an integrated management system. The first trait from the normative framework is organizational learning. Opportunities to learn about ways to ensure safety are sought out and implemented. On the positive side, Socalgas provides training to maintain a knowledgeable, competent workforce and instill safety, although personnel safety, values. We observed training technology that was up to date. The training complex that is maintained is also very useful and helps to achieve this knowledgeable and competent workforce. Socalgas shares information as part of Sempra's enterprise dashboard on safety and upstream indicators for downstream performance. And we'll talk a little bit later about how this is a positive. However, sometimes the indicators are often lagging indicators, not leading indicators. In terms of areas in need of attention, many interviewees, when asked what lessons were learned from the Aliso Canyon event, expressed the opinion that the most important learning was the importance of better communication with the public to avoid poor public relations. That was a fairly common response that people gave us, that this was a PR event more than other issues that they would identify. And the second bullet here is that many interviewees expressed the opinion that Socalgas is a reactive organization. And this goes along with what we mentioned before about a compliance type of mindset or culture, that the organization waits for things to happen until it responds, rather than trying to be more proactive and seeking out opportunities to prevent things from happening. Next slide, please. And the trait associated with theme 4 here, the second and I believe the last trait, is problem identification and resolution. The framework defines this as issues potentially impacting safety are promptly identified, fully evaluated, and promptly addressed and corrected commensurate with their significance. On the positive side, documentation indicates that Sempra conducts audits across the Socalgas organization. And so, in fact, this is a more centralized way of identifying problems across Socalgas. The second positive observation is that interviewees indicated that 14 current Socalgas applications are being replaced with one common platform. Questions about the transition remains, but the idea to finally integrate these applications through one platform was a real positive observation, because to date, many of the ways that an organization can learn were not available because these different applications could not talk to each other. In terms of areas in need of attention, first bullet is that Socalgas has not implemented a program with a low threshold for identifying issues from within its own organization. We understood that many of the causal analyses programs, many of the reporting systems are really not helping the organization to understand some of the things that, even though may be minor, could in fact end up being more problematic if they're not identified sooner. The second bullet is that Socalgas interviewees indicated that suggestions for improvements take too long to get a response, or they do not receive a clear response. So if people identify problems and they don't get a response, not necessarily that the problem is fixed, but at least some feedback on the problem, then they're going to stop identifying the problem. And so this is something that interviewees said was not happening, that they were not getting that kind of feedback. Okay, next slide, I believe. And so these were the samples of the kinds of facts that we identified through the 5 methods that Monica had explained to you. We then created the themes, the 4 themes, the overarching themes. And then in preparing the conclusions, we tried to identify kind of more simple and understandable ways to think about it. And I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Stan, to present the conclusions. Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Dietz, you're on mute.
So maybe I should start by saying culture is what you choose to pay attention to. And mute is one of those things. I want to, of course, emphasize just how much data is present here. And Sonia goes through, an incredibly sophisticated kind of analysis based in so many data points from the documents, from the observations, from interviews, surveys, and of course, the focus groups themselves. And so when we come to conclusions, obviously, we're far less complete than we are when we're talking about the large amount of data. But it's, I think, important at the same time to kind of draw attention to what are the most basic things that really stand out here that finally will feed into recommendations and so forth. So if you would go to the first slide. And so the conclusions here are organized around these normative questions we raised in terms of trying to compare to a normative framework to ask how well is the organization doing, what are the kinds of things that are happening well, what are the kinds of things that might need attention. As Sonia emphasized, the leaders of the organization are clearly very active in espousing values. But in most cases, these clearly emphasize the personnel safety issues. And this includes such things as safety congresses, what takes place in the tailgate discussions, the kinds of information memos that go out, how the safety messages lead off meetings and so forth. And so we're looking at a whole bunch of different kinds of contexts in which safety might be concerned. And in each of these cases, what we see is this incredible emphasis on personnel safety. And so when we look at the leadership, there certainly is a need for a stronger internalization of all kinds of safety throughout both organizations, Socalgas and Sempra, from the board to the frontline personnel. So this is the deeper issue, right? So if we have a lot of behaviors at the surface talking about safety, we're really asking the question, but so what are the assumptions and values underlying this that is directing the behavior toward a particular kind of discussion and not necessarily toward all the kinds of discussions they might be having? For example, when we have a tailgate, why aren't we talking about environmental safety issues, or why aren't we talking about security needs within the site or within the equipment themselves? In other words, what we'd like to see here is that the leadership begin to emphasize a greater internalization of the full range of issues of safety. And we hear at different points in the interviews people bringing up that there's a need for more concern with psychological safety and so forth. So what we feel is that the organization has some sense of the lack of this internalization of broader notions, but when we listen to the talk and looking at the programs, we don't see this taking place. And that directly feeds into this notion of effective safety communication. So if safety is fairly narrowly conceptualized in terms of personnel safety, it is no surprise that most of the downward communication takes place around those issues. And we see a lot of emphasis in terms of the measurement of such things as personnel safety, which is an easy lagging instrument to be able to identify because we can count how many accidents have been had, we can count reports and so forth. But it turns out to be a way in which we constantly re-emphasize this notion downward in the organization that personnel safety is of great concern. And it's not that that isn't of great concern, and certainly the members of the organization appreciate greatly that people are concerned about their safety. It is simply the question of how does this then impact upon the overall safety performance of the organization. Part of this comes up is when we look at the statements made around the need for enhanced upward communication. There's a lot of things that are happening in the field that don't seem to be making their way up the organization. And these include such things as the relatively repetitive concern with staffing issues, the amount of overtime and fatigue that are being experienced by members and their own perceptions of the consequences of overtime and fatigue, the emergency response systems. In other words, there's a lot of talk taking place at the field that is indicating a number of kinds of concerns, but we don't see that kind of talk permeating up the organization and being made into careful consideration of policies, even at the level of the workers feeling as if those concerns are getting heard. And so clearly there's a need here that we're seeing to enhance the upward communication that takes into account these kind of field-based experiences. Now, clearly managers do at times go into the field, though they report more often going into the field than what the people in the field report, them being there and identifying what's taking place. And it does seem to be the case based on the interview comments that more often the interaction is with supervisors and others and less with actually looking at the field conditions and the people who are there. And of course, in the next level of the safety communication is what we've referred to as the difficulty of the silos. When we talk about the notion of a silo, we're talking about the difficulty of information going across the organization. For example, if public safety is primarily concerned in terms of risk assessments and the safety discussion takes place around personnel, these two groups feel that each is doing their responsibility, but each is not talking to the other in terms of what is being understood and learned across these things. If public relations take care of the relationship to the public, that does not necessarily mean that the information from the public is carefully fed into things like risk assessment or into the safety messages themselves. In other words, when we have silos, what we're lacking is the ways in which we can learn across these things. And instead what we have is a specification of a responsibility, which isn't able to then learn from the information that's being disseminated and acquired within other parts of the organization. And so clearly the need to break these silos, getting away from that is somebody's job somewhere in the organization into this understanding that this is our responsibility, and that will require a certain kind of communication across the groups of the organization. When we look at decision-making and work processes, again, let's go back to the staffing issue. This came up so frequently in terms of the discussions. And it's not clear in terms of those discussions how many areas are affected. We know that some are impacted far more than others, and that the impact is taking place around such things as commuting to work, being out of jobs, the time that it takes to replace personnel. In other words, it's not just one thing, it's a system that seems here to be working. Does it take too long to replace people? For example, how long it takes to post jobs, how long it takes to hire and train before you have a person that is actually replacing somebody in the field. And during that time, something is being done to fill in for them. And it's also a question of just how the resources themselves are allocated in terms of making sure that adequate staffing is present for emergency response and other types of things that directly impact the public safety. And we have a little more complex issue that is very much intersects with the notion of compliance and so forth. So this is a very large organization covering an incredibly large area, having an infrastructure that dates across a number of periods of time with different kinds of pipes, with different types of equipment, intersecting with different kinds of utilities. In other words, this is complex. The soil types are different. The way you dig in soil, the way you shore the holes are different across a number of things. And therefore, field conditions are themselves often unexpected and complex. The maps are frequently reported as being out of date in terms of response from other utilities and so forth. So individuals are being asked to make fairly complex decisions based in guidelines that are written to be fairly general. And so the individual is left here in a situation of having to make choices. And it's not clear that they're necessarily prepared to do that. And over time, as the more senior members who actually may have been there 30 years ago when a pipe was laid and have a lot of local knowledge in terms of how things worked and how they were done, as these senior members have left, the more junior members coming in do not have that same kind of expertise and knowledge. And therefore, they're called upon, even structurally, to seek the supervisor's input in terms of how to deal with these situations. But the supervisors themselves frequently do not have field experience and do not have this background knowledge either. And so there's a need here for a better way for the personnel to be prepared to make the kind of complex choices in and around the policies and procedures in these unexpected field situations and the complexity that actually exists within a large organization covering a large territory with many generations of pipes and equipment that are there. The next slide, please. So this moves us into this question of the environment for raising concerns and the ways in which the questioning attitude that it is actually utilized in the organization. Clearly, there's a lot of respect for the questioning attitude and around, especially personnel safety. We see people using it. We see people not being penalized necessarily for using it and so forth. And so there's some really basic principles here, especially at the behavioral level, that are very, very positive. Okay. But there's a deeper cultural issue here that leaves us with certain kinds of questions. In other words, we're not necessarily seeing across all the sites the same ability to raise concerns. In other words, if you look at the survey data, where it maybe shows up in the most quantitative way, but it's also true in all the other kinds of data, the sites differ greatly in terms of the feeling that people have that they can raise a concern, that the concern will be addressed. And it's not just a question of raising the concern, but people don't raise concerns they don't think people are going to hear or address. And there feels like there's a kind of imaginary line, at least in workers' minds, that when I raise a concern, it only can go this far, and I don't have an ability to get it to the place that it needs to be addressed, or I don't know what happened after I raised that concern. And so there is a deeper level here for people to be able to raise these bigger questions. And of course, they need to be able to raise these questions around things more than personnel safety. In other words, methane release is an interesting and important issue. It's an environmental hazard. Security concerns are very important in a politically charged time. And it's not clear that people necessarily are making observations of where there are risks of this sort. And it's unclear that they feel as if they have a way of reporting it and getting these things responded to. Continuous learning and problem identification. One of the things that you see over and over in terms of the data that we were able to get to is a lack of adequate knowledge capture and the transference of that knowledge. At a number of levels, there is succession planning, realizing that if somebody leaves, they will take with them tremendous amounts of tacit and other kinds of knowing that are very, very important to the ways in which people function and make decisions. But in many cases, the people are saying, I just don't know what the person before me knew. And there wasn't a period of time of work overlap for me to learn the things that the person I'm replacing already knew in these things. And we saw no formal system of exit interviews and other ways of trying to capture the knowledge that a person may have as they exit from the organization. And even in terms of routine work activities, it isn't clear that as people learn new things on a job, especially as they work in some of these situations, that knowledge is well captured. Certainly in the field, when we have a customer representative going there, they do type notes. And some of those notes are available to the next person that goes to that site. But it's not always clear that those notes are readily available, are very complete, or really address the things that the person is going to need to know as they go to that next site. And again, this requires a way of a better, in a more systematic way, determining what knowledge we need to have and capture and the ways in which we're going to transfer that into the situations and places that it needs to be known. And as we work more and more with people with handheld devices, the information they get, of course, comes out on a fairly small screen in which they have to scroll quite a bit. The search processes are not exactly the same as they are on some of the computer systems. And so there needs to be a constant concern with the technologies and the interface between the knowledge that we're capturing, the ways in which that's being recorded and put into databases, and the ways it's actually being transferred to the people that are going to need it. And that comes to, of course, also the level of the indicators themselves. It's quite clear that part of the emphasis on personnel safety is that personnel safety leads to a lot of very useful and specific lagging indicators. You can measure accidents, you can do sorts of things, and it's easy to make a reward system around indicators of that sort. It is less clear how evolving problems, the ones that are actually coming up or may potentially become a problem, are being fed into the system. And that is, how are we measuring, for example, the positive growth of trust or the positive growth of reporting at the level of trying to determine whether or not the company is getting the kinds of information it needs to assess the kinds of things that are coming along. One of the difficulties, of course, always with public safety is that these are rarer events than personnel safeties are. In other words, by the time we get a major public safety event taking place, there's a whole history that has taken place prior to this that has not necessarily been in any sense recorded. And it happens infrequently enough that simply the lagging indicator, the identification of what took place in the accident, is not sufficient to give the company an understanding of the kind of emerging situations that are potentially of interest to it. And therefore, there's a need here for a better way of recording the kinds of knowledge and getting that knowledge into the notion of the anticipation of the types of things that may in fact put the public safety at risk on this. This is part of trying to offset the compliance mindset, because the compliance mindset tends to only work with the kinds of things that have already occurred, right? Because the policy gets written around the occurrence of something that took place. And so the compliance mindset gets into, okay, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm following the procedures, at least the best that I can. But it doesn't necessarily mean that I am looking ahead and anticipating the kinds of things that may be occurring that we need to be paying attention to into the future. So the compliance mindset means that I have done what I should do, not that I have paid attention to what we have not yet considered adequately as a possibility of something that might happen that is very important to us. And this feeds into pretty directly into the personnel accountability. Personal accountability means that people are willing and able to take blame, okay? That they recognize when they're at fault and are able to make corrective actions around those things. We heard a tremendous amount of shifting of blame and a tremendous amount of concern that I not get blamed. CYA came up a lot in a lot of the focus groups and a lot of the interviews as a underlying concern that I need to always make sure that I have documented what I did, but not for the purpose of learning, but to document what I did to be sure that the blame doesn't get pushed onto me. And so you have this kind of feeling within the organization that the accountability and responsibility themselves are fairly tenuous, right? That they're put into this kind of cultural context, which people are responding in ways that do not necessarily lead to the organization's learning and ability here to allow people to take responsibility for things. You know, obviously culture, one of its important powers is that culture determines what people do when no one's watching. And so if we don't have a culture that really specifies and helps a person guide their action in a lot of the situations with their placed in which there may be some ambiguity in terms of what their responsibilities are or what the correct action may be, then we of course lead to problems. And so that we see places in which people do compliance and care in making sure they're not being held responsible, even in cases in which the best judgment based in the field and based in their field experience might suggest other choices. And that's not a very useful thing. What we want to be happening here is that the people identifying a field situation and that have field experience are able to be able to utilize that in a way that makes the best choice and that the company get the information that it needs to respond to that. We found over and over again people reporting that they really didn't know of the various kinds of near misses that took place or what the company's response to it was. Reported again and again the kinds of things that we don't know how well it is documented, the kinds of things that somebody found out or learned that might be useful for me in the future. And so back to this idea of how we capture knowledge, how we transfer it, connects into this place of how one takes accountability and responsibility. In other words, if you don't have the ability to get the information and knowledge, then of course one defers back to the notion of simply following the rule that seems to be in place or the thing that the supervisor said to do, even though they may not necessarily be in that condition. So again, trying here to summarize these things and still at the same time humanize them in a different way. Again, the data is in the report. It's very important to return to constantly the kinds of statements that are being made. So that concludes our overall kind of view of these of what we found within the analysis. So I'm going to turn it back, I guess, to Monica, right?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stan, and thank you, Sonia, for presenting our results. And as you may understand, there is a lot more in the report. I hope you will take the time to look at it because there you have much more facts and much more than we are able to present here. So I will give it over to Carolina and we will see what we will do. We are a little bit earlier than expected. We thought we will use a little bit more time, but we are where we are. So over to you, Carolina. And we can stop sharing the presentation. Thank you, Joe. Carolina, are you taking over?
Well, this is Commissioner Rechtschaff, and is there anyone else on staff? We have time allocated for questions after lunch. So I don't, that's what I think we should stick with, but I want to make sure.
Commissioner Rechtschaff, and this is Saab. I could.
Okay, please take away.
Sure. So the time is 11:45. I think it might be a good opportunity to take the 1 hour lunch and then reconvene at 12:45 and then take questions from individuals at that point.
Sub, we can't, the commissioners have a closed session from 12 to 1, so we can't start early, but I suggest we just take an extra 15 minutes of break.
Sounds
People
good.
will appreciate the found time and resume at 1.
Perfect. Thank you, Commissioner.
And just everybody, I'm not sure if you can hear me right now. I've had some, I think I was muted on the screen. But yes, I appreciate for taking over. And yes, let's reconvene at 1 then. And any questions, please let me know. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone. It is now closer to 1:05, so hopefully most participants have joined or will be joining shortly. So let's proceed. President Reynolds will join us in a little bit as well. This afternoon, we'll get started with the first Q&A session on content that has been presented so far. If you have a question on recommendations, we ask that you please wait for the second session. I will open it now to questions from our commissioners on the virtual dais.
Carolina, I have a couple of questions, if I could. I don't know if you could see me or see us.
Please go ahead, Commissioner Rechtschaffen.
Okay. Thank you very much. My first question deals with feedback from contractors. And the report notes that your efforts to get feedback from contractors was not successful. You didn't have much of a response record, a good response record. And at the same time, some of the survey comments from employees indicated that a perception that contractors are held to a different standard as Socalgas employees, and there wasn't enough oversight of contractors, maybe because there's less liability directly for the companies. So my question is, the basic question is, do you think another effort should be made to get more feedback from contractors?
I can start to answer that, and maybe Mark will have something to add about the survey, but we did conduct interviews and focus groups with contractors. So it's not like they were not represented, and we did have focus groups with some of the larger contractors to Socalgas. So I am not sure, this might be just an example of how the contractors respond to expectations in the company. Mark, I don't know if you want to add anything about the survey.
Yeah, so the doing surveys, perception surveys, is challenging, and I think it's very notable that both Sempra and Socalgas had very high response rates. So they're probably more the exception than the rule. And the contractor response rate is more in the sort of typical, or even in some cases maybe better than typical response rates for these kinds of surveys. The methodology that we use and the standards that we set for surveys is pretty high because we want to be confident in the results that we receive, right? So if you get 50% who respond, you're pretty confident that the 50% who responded are not the same as, they're going to be different from the 50% who didn't respond, and it makes it difficult to interpret the data. And although we did look at the data in terms of, I looked at it and produced a report, and the results weren't particularly different from the other companies, really it was felt that we had other data points that were useful, so we weren't just missing that data, and really we wouldn't be confident in the statements we would make around the surveys just because of the poorer response rate. And it was just a much more complex activity. So within the contractor, there was many of them, right? So there was 20 or 30 different contractors, some very small, with only sort of 20 or 30 employees, some quite large. And that, I think, created the challenge. And also, the surveys for the contractors needed to be done in many cases on paper, which added another logistical challenge to the contracting companies. So I would say that it was a shame that we weren't able to include that data. We did put in, both Socalgas and ourselves put in significant effort and hours trying to make that happen. I think it was one of the things that was probably more of a casualty of the pandemic than maybe people would have immediately identified. The original plan was, when we were doing the worksite visits, that I would go and have sessions with contractors and get them to complete the survey at that point in time. Due to the pandemic, I wasn't able to travel, and also we had other sort of priorities, so we weren't able to do that. So I wouldn't read too much into it that we got a poorer response rate. I don't think it's indicative of a lack of engagement of the contractors. It was more of just a methodological challenge that we ran into. And if there was no pandemic, I think we wouldn't be having this conversation. Does that, in a roundabout way, answer your question?
In a roundabout way, I guess what you're saying is you don't think there's enough missing that another effort should be made on or at least nothing different until we can have a different post-pandemic world.
Yeah. I don't have, if I had all the money in the world and all the time in the world, that would not be where I would spend my effort. I don't think we're going to get anything particularly different, but I'm also wouldn't be willing to say, oh yeah, use that contractor report and their data, because I don't have confidence in it. That's why I wasn't willing to put it forward in the report, because I couldn't put my hand and said I'm confident in the results.
But at the least we have findings from employees that raise concerns that should be addressed about lack of comparable treatment or inadequate oversight, things like that, that don't depend on more usable surveys being returned or things like that.
Yeah. It was only one source of data, and we had many other sources. So the survey was one point, we wouldn't, we had other information.
Okay, I have a two-part question then, if I could, Carolina. So the question is this: for the work where the safety focus that you think is appropriate and a positive feature of what you observed, which is focus on personnel issues, did you also find that for those personnel issues, there was still a compliance-only mentality? So that's the first question. And then maybe a flip side, or I don't know if I'm thinking about this the right way, but for safety of the public and contractors and folks outside of Socalgas's employees, where we regulate more heavily, do you think that the more narrow focus on compliance is in large part or some part an artifact of how closely regulated they are? In other words, do they define safety as just as what regulators say it is because we're telling them what to do? So those are two, I guess they're not really flip sides of the same questions. They're two separate questions. I apologize. As a lawyer, I'm not supposed to ask compound questions, but maybe you could address each in turn.
I'll start with the second one first, in terms of, you know, is the compliance a function of the regulatory relationship? And having worked in other regulated industries, you know, I've always thought, as regulators do, that regulators cannot demand or do not expect excellence, right? They really expect compliance, and that it's up to the organization or the licensee, the utilities, to create the excellence and want to be beyond the compliance. So I think it is a function of the regulatory relationship to an extent, but there are organizations that go beyond the compliance into achieving more performance excellence. I don't know if anybody else on the team wants to add something to that question. The second question was, the first question was with respect to, on the positive, is it only because of compliance? Was that, did I get that right?
For personnel issues, for the focus on personnel issues, which you
Right.
commended, is it nonetheless more narrow than you would, than normatively we would want? Is that also a compliance oriented or a compliance focused safety approach?
And this is a personal opinion from my part in the assessment. I think that for personnel safety, as we indicated, it is really expressed as a sincere value in the organization, and they have done things, I think, that are perhaps above and beyond compliance. I can't say exactly for sure, because some of it is COVID related, and I'm not sure exactly what all the regulations were in California during that time and responses to that extent. But I believe, and I think employees believe, and that we interviewed, that the company does care about people and does protect people.
Thank you for those responses.
Thank you, commissioners. Any other commissioner questions? Please go ahead, Commissioner Houck.
So the report finds that Sempra safety programs are siloed and that therefore they don't provide a holistic view of risk. Can you talk about some ways that the CPUC could use its safety requirements to influence licensees to establish programs that are more holistic?
With respect to giving examples, or is that what you're asking?
Yeah, if you have examples of that.
Well, when we talk about an integrated management system, that essentially is a system that connects all the processes, all the different types of safety, including risk management systems, and it would be incorporated under one, say, an umbrella of an organization. And through that integrated management system, you ensure that considerations around all kinds of safety, as well as risk, get treated in a way that they're all considered with each other and not independently or compartmentalized. And I think we address that in the report. So for an example, in Socalgas, there is a integrity management program, but the integrity management program has 4 pillars in it. And those 4 pillars are not coordinated under a centralized system. So they're each looking at a particular aspect, whether it be storage or, you know, what the 4 different aspects are, and there's no sense of an umbrella or centralized focus around that. But an integrated management system would take that, in addition to other concepts of safety, the bigger picture of safety, and help the organization consider those in all of its changes and processes.
You would also mention that The Commission, Sempra, and Socalgas should align around a broad concept of safety culture and suggested a more collaborative learning approach. Are there areas or specific recommendations you have on how that type of collaborative approach could provide tools for us as a regulator to help encourage, for example, some of the more holistic mechanisms you were just discussing?
Yeah, with all due respect, Commissioner, I believe we'll address that in the recommendations section.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And then I guess the only other question would be, can you provide some examples of industries that have successfully implemented some of the organizational cultural safety recommendations that you have here? Just give some examples for us to look at.
I believe we'll also discuss that in the recommendations. We point that out for both the regulator and for the utility.
Commissioner Houck, I'd be happy to get back, also point that out when we get to that section.
Okay, that would be great.
Commissioner Sharona, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Very insightful. One clarification question and a couple of additional questions. So first of all, this is on Sempra and Socalgas. So in terms of Sempra's assessment, this is in terms of its umbrella governance over Socalgas and not over San Diego Gas and Electric. Is that right? So this didn't look at San Diego Gas and Electric.
We did not. The only piece would be there are a couple of shared services, but we did not look at San Diego Gas and Electric. That was not in the scope of our of the OII.
Okay. Okay. And then on the assessment of really what you refer to as the experience drain, the brain drain, the folks who worked on something for 30 years and now they're gone. Maybe somebody took notes, maybe they didn't. Does in the assessment as staff go out into the field to assess a particular pipe or connection or issue or what have you, do they have a process in place to actually research what knowledge there is?
I'm sorry, Commissioner, you're breaking up. I don't know if it's me or I'm having difficulty hearing the question. Did anybody hear that?
I can repeat the
Sonia,
question.
Go ahead, Commissioner Sharoma. And just so you know, Sonia, I'm hearing Commissioner Sharoma okay.
Okay.
I'll ask the question again.
Okay, thank you.
In your review of the processes that Socalgas uses, when an inspector, let's say, is assigned or a team is assigned to go into the field to troubleshoot or to address a specific assignment, as part of that protocol, do they research what information is available through the database or through some sort of tracking, or do they just show up at the assignment?
Are you're talking about the Socalgas inspectors that go out?
That's right, yeah.
They do, from our observations, they do look at the background information for the assignment that they're going at, to the extent that it is in the database. And I think that there were some cases where it may not have been in the database, but they do have a record of some degree if they're going back to the same location or on a new assignment.
Okay. And then my other question has to do with your slide. It's overarching theme 4. The normative trait is organizational learning. And it is the areas in need of attention, which says many interviewees, when asked what lessons were learned from the Lethal Canyon event, expressed the opinion that the most important learning was the importance of better communication with the public to avoid poor public relations. Now, I found that really astounding. Now, it says many interviewees. Are you able to describe the panoply of interviewees that expressed this opinion? Was it executive, staff, union, contractors, or all the above?
It is all of the above. And it is for the most part. Of course, you have some individuals who may have expressed something else, but remember that the bullets up there are because it's a general shared belief and it was heard multiple times.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, I'll look forward to hearing your recommendations and next steps. Thank you. Back to you, Carolina.
Thank you, Commissioner Sharoma. I want to quickly check if President Reynolds may have any questions since she may have joined us. President Reynolds, are you with us?
I am, Carolina. Apologies, I had a conflict in the last few minutes, but I am on now. I don't have any questions at this moment. I look forward to continuing to listen to comments.
Thank you, Commissioners. So before moving on to verbal questions, we will first go over the questions that parties pre-submitted ahead of the workshop. And if we could go to the previous slide, please. Great. So these questions are shown on the slide for reference. Those on the slide show those that are related to the first Q&A session, so primarily about methodology and some background on the assessment and the findings themselves. Anything about recommendations we've put in the second session in case you don't see your question up there. So starting with the first question, this was submitted by the Center for Accessible Technology. The question is, the 2EC report identifies as a concern that discussions of safety at Socalgas Sempra focus narrowly on personnel safety and do not adequately address issues of public safety. In that context, C4AT would like to understand how appropriate consideration of public safety would address the needs of particularly vulnerable members of the public, including our constituency of customers with disabilities and medical needs. The needs of vulnerable members of the public, which may also include low-income communities, people who do not speak English as their primary language, and others, may be different and or greater than the needs of the general public on issues of safety, and C4AT understands that they should be given separate considerations. What would 2EC's recommendations be on this issue?
I believe that the answer that the 2EC will have is that when we're talking about public safety, we are considering all sectors of the public in our consideration of public safety. So at this time, we would not make any difference for any of the different parts of that sector.
Thank you, Sonia. I will move on to the second question. That was submitted by the Public Advocate's Office. The question is, Blade Root Cause Analysis Report. In the Commission Order Instituting Investigation, so for this proceeding, the Commission stated on page 9 that this investigation will instead conduct a deeper comprehensive review of Socalgas and Sempra Energy's organizational culture, governance, and operations, and determine if there are systemic issues in particular by considering the Blade Root Cause Analysis Report. How did 2EC take Blade report into account in the assessment of Socalgas's safety culture? It is not included in the 2EC report, but the OII indicates that this shall be considered within the scope of this proceeding. So before turning it over to 2EC to answer this question, I just want to clarify that a subsequent ruling issued on July 27, 2019, a month after the OII was issued, directed that the consultant may consider the Blade report and other information relating to the Aliso Canyon gas leak with the understanding that Socalgas disputes aspects of the Blade energy report. 2EC was made aware of this change. So with that, I will hand it over to 2EC to respond.
The Blade report was considered as one of the documents in our document review among the many hundreds of documents that we received. We did not want to give it any additional review or in-depth review, because we wanted our review to be independent and not biased by that report. But we did review it, and it was included in our document review.
Thank you, Sonia. We move on to the next question, also from the Public Advocate's Office. And I believe this question was answered via Commissioner Rechtschaffen's question. So is there anything else that you would like to add? And this is relating to contractors, the contractors' inclusion in the assessment. So I believe that this has been answered. Anything else that 2EC would like to add there?
No, I think it's been answered.
Okay, thank you. So with the next question, also from the Public Advocate's Office, this is regarding obtaining additional information. How can Cal Advocates obtain additional information on Sempra safety culture assessment that is not included within the 2EC report? For example, should we write a data request to the 2EC Sempra or Commission staff? Additionally, additional information on the survey's response rates. For example, the study report includes the number of surveys distributed to employees and the number of responses, but does not include the total number of employees. So we don't know the proportion of total staff that were sampled. So to respond to this question, I just want to address the bigger question about additional information. For the time being, this workshop is precisely the venue to obtain the information you need about the assessment. That said, if there are remaining clarifying questions about the report, you may let me know and we can see about obtaining that information. However, I can't make any guarantees, but we can try to get answers to your clarifying questions. Again, it's all going to depend on the nature of the question and clarifying, and that it's all pertaining to the report. But on the second portion of this question, I want to turn it to 2EC about the surveys distributed to employees and the numbers. So to you, Sonia.
Sure. The numbers were presented in the report. The appendix to the report includes the particular survey reports for both Sempra and Socalgas. And the population for Socalgas was the total number of employees as given to us from their employee lists. And for Sempra, it was the total number of employees that, with respect to those, especially that interacted with Socalgas and out of corporate headquarters.
Thank you, Sonia. Though that is the end of the questions submitted ahead of the workshop, so we will now take questions from attendees. You'll be called in the order you indicate an interest in participating. As a reminder, if you are a party and have questions for 2EC or staff, not an formal public comment, please follow these instructions. WebEx participants should click on the raise hand icon in the participants menu on the lower right-hand corner. Phone participants should unmute phones and dial *3 and listen out for the 6 digits of your phone. I'll move on to the first question. Please remember to state your name and organization, and I will ask the technical host to please unmute the first party with questions. Joe, will you please unmute our first party? We give Joe just one moment with this.
Good afternoon. I do not see any attendees. Just going through the roster again to make absolutely sure. Yeah, I don't see any attendees with, oh, there's, I do have one.
It looks like it is Noel Obiora. Noel Obiora, the IT host will unmute you for your question, so you may go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for this very enlightening presentation. My question goes to the somewhat to the question that Commissioner Rechtschaffen asked regarding the focus on personnel safety. I was wondering what considerations, if any, 2EC gave to the extent to which strict penalties from regulatory agencies that oversee personal safety played a role in how much leadership and the company are focusing on personal safety. And I'll just give a context to that. Having been doing safety OIIs before the commission, and when we talk to when we talk and have conversations with some of our colleagues in other regulatory agencies, they sort of suggest that because of how strict OSHA is when it implements safety compliance and safety penalties, a lot of these companies do not mess around, forgive my colloquialism, with personal safety. And I was wondering to what extent that plays a role in this primary focus on personal safety over public safety.
If I understand you correctly, just to rephrase to make sure that your question has to do with to what extent on the role of other regulatory agencies around personnel safety, perhaps emphasizing or directing Socalgas and Sempra more towards personnel safety. Is that correct?
IT host, could you please unmute Mr. Noel? Sonia,
yes, that's partially correct, but I was focusing particularly on these agencies' ability to implement very strict penalties and insist upon it with respect to the agencies they regulate, to the extent that a company like Socalgas might think that the penalties may not be as strictly enforced or as strictly followed by an agency that oversees public safety versus OSHA that would not take an inch in implementing a personal safety issue.
Mr. Obiora, may I also ask that you state your organization?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm actually a late attendee for the Cal Advocates, Public Advocates Office with the California Public Utilities Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Obiora. Go ahead, Sonia.
Okay, now I understand your question. Thank you. We did not look at that impact with respect to other agencies. We did look at financial considerations with respect to CPUC and Socalgas and Sempra reporting to CPUC, but not to other agencies. So we cannot really address how that influenced the impact or the emphasis on personnel safety.
Thank you, Sonia. Could we please move on to the question by Mr. Eric Hoffman and unmute his line?
Hi, Mr. Hoffman, I've unmuted you. If you could check your mute button.
Thank you very much for this presentation. My name is Eric Hoffman, and I'm president of the Utility Workers Union of America, Local 132, representing over 3,000 workers that work specifically at Socalgas. And so my question to 2EC and this whole workshop really is around the recommendation of sort of a recommendation of a move away from more compliance-driven initiatives and to be more behavioral or performance focused. My question is how are my members who go to work every day in the field, who are responsible for adhering and complying with the standards that we have, from Socalgas that are largely driven from the General Order 112F or CFR 49, everything is, we are held to that standard to be in compliance with those regulations. And as a former rank and file employee myself, having the pleasure of having an investigation or an investigation from this Sempra, the Safety Enforcement Division of the CPUC to observe me on a job, and their findings are that, for just one example, their findings were that my rags, for my soapy rags, that the soap to water viscosity ratio may not be in full compliance to the standard, as if I'm in the field and have the ability to take my rags into a laboratory to make sure that the soap to water ratio is within the acceptable viscosity limits. I guess my question is, if as long as my members are going to be held to that sort of scrutiny and standard, how can we take this? How can we as a union take this recommendation as sort of a move away from these compliance initiatives and more to be more behavioral and performance based? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Nowhere did we state that there is a move away from compliance. There has to be compliance, and it's a regulated industry. The point we were making was that in addition to compliance, to have a healthy safety culture, you want to see organizations also move more into the performance arena and eventually into the systemic arena, meaning that you don't eliminate any phase, you build onto that phase. So your members are going to have to, of course, be in compliance, but the hope is that in being more proactive about safety and in enhancing safety culture, that you would move also, the organization would move into the performance as well as the systemic phase.
Thank you, Sonia. We do not appear to have any other questions from WebEx or from the phone. Just want to check with our IT host that he doesn't see any either. IT, Joe, would you be able to confirm?
Yes, confirming. No more hands raised.
Thank you. So I want to thank Commissioner's questions. I want to thank 2EC for this section as well. Without further questions in this particular material, I think we can go ahead and move on to the second portion of 2EC's presentation. We'll turn it over to you, Monica, but before, I'm just going to ask that we please change the slides.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you for the questions, and thank you for the help, Sonia, with answering them. And also thank you to Mark. Okay, so now we're coming into the next part here about the recommendations. And you will see that they might look a little bit different. And that is because we believe that, as we were showing you from the beginning, that we want to work with the whole culture, not only the shallowish part. And that is important to not to do just corrective actions one-to-one on the different facts that we have shared with you today. We want to have a more holistic and in-depth recommendations. And I will give it over to Stan Leeks, who will go through the recommendations with you. You ready, Stan?
I am ready.
Good.
So why don't we turn to the first slide? So this is simply to reiterate what Monica began to introduce here, that the recommendations that we're doing are going to look to this entire bundle of culture that is looking not only at the kinds of behaviors, but also the shared values, and even more important, at the assumptions on underlying things. And so when we talk about this, we're not going to be looking at a list of remedial actions. We're going to be looking at an understanding of the kinds of forces that exist in the organization that are leading to the things that we think need to be given more attention, also leading to the kinds of successes. So we're looking at the ways in which these things work together and how they're generated out of the culture. And therefore, you'll not see a list of discrete corrective actions. We find that those do not necessarily stick if you're not working with the larger notion of culture that in fact leads to the types of behaviors that are taking place. And so we're really looking at these deeper levels. And we're going to be looking at these from a systemic standpoint, and that is the interrelationships that exist among the various people and aspects of organizational life. Again, it doesn't work to do piecemeal things. That is, frequently when we try to fix simply a little part of something, there are reasons in the larger organization why that little thing exists the way that it does. And so we're looking really at the whole system and the systemic consequences of that system around how it affects particular behaviors. And we believe that if you do it in this way, that if we move beyond simply a compliance mindset into this larger understanding, that it actually has considerable cost benefits for both organizations as well as to the public itself. And so what we're doing here, when you look at these recommendations, is really looking at this type of a holistic kind of an orientation, looking at the culture as the primary and important driver of this, and trying to understand how to engage the culture and cultural change as a way to fulfill the kinds of goals that we have. Next slide, please. And so we're going to start back with the basic issues that came from the normative framework. And we're going to look at this first from the standpoint of Sempra, then Socalgas, and then a few items in terms of Cpuc. And so we start with Sempra in the sense of this need for a more robust, more complete definition of safety itself. Within Sempra, as an oversight and governing body, it's very important that they reach some kind of an understanding of the broader sense of safety that begins to establish the kind of framework of thinking that in fact guides and helps Socalgas meet their objectives. And so the first thing that we want to point out in terms of this need of attention is really the lack of a clear and robust concept of safety. And so our recommendation is to begin to work from Sempra's standpoint to develop policies and technological systems that support a transition to an enterprise risk management type system that's inclusive of a comprehensive view of safety, and essentially an enterprise-wide safety management system. Okay, that is the goal we set out for them. In terms of how to achieve this, we believe that it is best achieved by a fairly robust and complete engagement of dialogue amongst the various parties, the board of directors and the executives, as well as being facilitated by external experts and independent experts to get a discussion going. It's not simply enough for us to recommend a new definition of safety. What we really want is the organization to begin to wrestle with this more complex and complete notion of safety and how they will bring that into parts of the organization. So it becomes their action for them to own as a way to reach this kind of goal that we set at the beginning. And from that, then, we begin to be able to, we hope they can to begin to define within their governance systems how this concept of safety will be actualized. And by governance systems, we mean the various oversights and audits, the personnel selection process, in other words, the full ranges of ways in which they impact upon Sempra's operations, is to begin to think about this concept of safety and what it does to the notion of governance. And of course, then with that, as they begin to become more coordinated within their concept of safety, we would anticipate that they would provide training on the new shared understandings, that they would find a way to develop the kind of facilitated sessions that make this concept not simply something that they've come to own and agree to, but now one that is deeply inculcated within the lives of organizational members. And so this is the kind of look we propose initially for Sempra in terms of the goal, some of the activities they may participate in. Next slide, please. For Socalgas, we're going to have a somewhat longer list because here we're looking at the very specific things that they might do regarding the kind of analysis that we made of their culture. So we start with the notion of the leadership values and actions that we've talked about both within the data and the conclusions. Basically, what we are seeing, of course, is this lack of a clear and robust concept of safety as a first and foremost issue. As in Sempra, it exists here. And that is, they need to come, or at least as an aspiration, to work toward the alignment of this wider concept of safety with Sempra's new guidance and help them to support a transition into this enterprise risk management system. We want it to be more inclusive of a comprehensive view of safety. And in doing this, of course, it will change the matrix and change the kinds of developing and leading indicators that they might use. All these will grow out of this notion of safety as now a shared understanding, now brought into the practice of, in fact, measurement and the notion of developing indicators and so forth. The guidance for this initial phase doesn't differ significantly from what we suggest for Sempra. They need to work with a system of dialogue supported and helped by external experts to begin to work through with their own board, with Sempra board, with the executives and senior management, a robust concept of safety that includes this broad sense of psychological safety, environmental safety, security, and so forth, along with the kinds of very careful things they've done currently in terms of personnel, to begin to develop this as a conceptual concept so that when safety is used, the first thing that comes to mind is this kind of robust, complex concept of a safety that's going to guide their actions. From this, then, of course, is to develop the same types of dialogues deeper into the organization, which is conducting dialogue sessions with all levels of the organization to begin to develop this kind of a shared understanding. And this is not a top-down, we have a new concept of safety, let's put it on the bulletin boards. This is an engagement of the organization itself in terms of coming to grips with this concept, to get clear what it means, how it really applies in their life work, so that it's not an abstract thing, but in fact is something that people have worked beyond the notion of a statement into how does this impact their practices? How do they go about their work and talking to incorporate this? And of course, this then becomes, again, supplemented by a training with practical kinds of examples of how this shared concept of safety changes the way the business is done. And it includes trying to talk about why it's important to make these changes and being very specific and concrete kinds of examples as to what kind of change that would make for them. Next slide, please. And so we move here directly to recommendations around the notion of siloing and more the kind of communication that takes place across the organization. Our observations have been supported by the data that we collected that Socalgas is a very siloed organization. Its functions are very vertically organized. There's not the type of communication that might be expected across the various kinds of divisions. And so we begin here with a recommendation that they develop a set of communication strategies that broaden the conversation around safety into this new shared notion of safety within cross-organizational levels. In other words, this is not each of the divisions saying, what piece of this new concept is mine? This is for us to think about, this is the new concept. How do we begin to integrate this across us so we may learn from each other, that we may see each other's successes, we may understand where we're beginning to be able to be integrated and where we're not. So it's an attempt here to get a much more shared understanding, not only of the concept of safety, but the communication that would be required across the divisions to assure that this concept of safety is actually put into practice, and that they're able to share information that allows them to progress into a more learning organization around this notion of how we incorporate safety. And so for the guidance part of this is that what we would expect here is the incorporation of this broader concept of safety, where it includes deeply examples of public safety, security, gets into the notion that these safety items become part of meetings agendas. They become part of tailgates. They become part of job hazard assessment. They become part of newsletters. In other words, to look at this in terms of what are the variable ways in which we can actually get this larger concept deep into the organization's DNA. They've done it largely in terms of personnel safety. It is a matter of now trying to take the learnings that have been fairly successful in terms of personnel safety and apply it to this broader notion of safety so that these become part of the everyday workers' understanding as they go to work as to what kinds of things we may want to do with safety. And so this would be conducting, again, these kind of dialogues across the representatives from different business units and really work toward how do we better gather this field-based experience and incorporate the field level understanding of problems and difficulties and risks into these discussions. So that the field isn't left here feeling as if they have no place to report or that's not getting responded to, but in fact, the field experience is deeply integrated into this notion of safety so that it both can enrich the notions of safety based in real practical life experience, and that enriched concept of safety can serve as a better guidance to the everyday practices of their development. And so this becomes, as we try to look through these movement of phases, this is not to lose compliance, but to say that compliance is not sufficient. And so that this is to work toward building guidance that allows people in these complex situations in which they're placed to go beyond simply rule-based behavior into an incorporation and inclusion of the wider understandings that one needs to have coming out of a richer cultural notion of how one is safe and what the obligations to public safety here might be. Next slide, please. The ultimate outcome, of course, of the types of things we're recommending is that the organization itself become a more learning organization, that it focus more on continuous learning from what's taking place, which includes better problem identification and resolution. So right now, the learning and safety systems are hampered because of the lack of integration. In other words, no system can succeed in this kind of a complex context unless it has the learning integrated across its various aspects and has the kind of communication that allows different parts of the organization to learn from each other. And therefore, this requires, in order for this kind of learning to take place in terms of a better recording, identification of problems and how they're being resolved, is to develop a management system that incorporates this safety, which transcends the group differences, that connects the organizational processes to meet these goals and performances. And that is to think of this as safety as an organizational goal and problem, not a unit problem or organization, not we take care of risk or we take care of pipeline integrity, but that the organization think of these as themselves complexly interrelated with work processes, allocation of resources, the way they design systems, that these become together to enrich the understanding of each of them and enhance the organization's learning. So that when we try to think about how to guide an organization to do this, obviously every organization's change process is based a lot in terms of the specific characteristics of that organization. In other words, this is not a cookie cutter to organizational change. This is an awareness that the organization needs to engage in some deep systematic changes, and that they probably need help to do that. If these were obvious changes to them, they would have done them. These are in fact complex and difficult kinds of change processes that take place. Even the best organizations need to be able to work toward developing specific kinds of change processes unique to their environment and unique to the problems that they're confronting. And so this requires that they develop a safety culture that is centralized across the organization. This is the kind of integration that assures this kind of alignment. And that we examine the various kinds of roles and function of the organization in terms of how they contribute to this whole, rather than just how do they perform their particular function. And so this requires, of course, is that we have ways in which we can use existing reporting systems that better track the types of things that are taking place, and that the lessons that are being learned from these are better shared across the organization, which requires a more uniform and a platform in order for this to be done. In other words, this needs to be a system which is easy to use, that is widely distributed, that it's important that they be able to understand from the personnel standpoint how it is, for example, a gas leak or a pipeline issue how it is that they have responded to it, how it is that this requires coordination across areas to do a appropriate response to it, and so forth. And therefore, all potential threats, near misses, close calls, need to be identified and tracked. We need to give up how they are trending so that we can proactively work to mitigate the risk. In other words, to go beyond compliance, to go in addition to this compliance notion, first to think more proactively. And that is not simply reacting to what's taking place in the rules and regulations, but to proactively begin to identify the types of things that create risk and the kinds of things that the person in the field frequently can recognize that may not have an appropriate way to record or know that they should be recording the type of risk that they see that may be developing. And of course, this requires then training managers and personnel to think in the kind of hypothetical scenarios, so what ifs, so that they can begin to think through in these particular circumstances, not just what have been the practices, but what are the risks that we have not yet identified. The biggest risks are most often unknown risks. And that is that we haven't thought about them because we haven't encountered them, or because our cultural way of thinking doesn't allow us to perceive and attend to those aspects of our environments. And therefore, working in these kinds of as-if scenarios to work at the possibility of things. And they've done very well with their simulations and other things to try to get at real environments that require these kind of communication. But I think it's important that when we observe some of this, that they think about these kinds of scenarios, these kinds of simulations, as requiring really a better integration of the activities and perhaps even doing more of them to understand the types of things that may in fact arise. Next slide, please. Our investigation was not of CPUC, but we did, of course, learn much about the relationship between CPUC and Socalgas and Sempra as we did our interviews and investigation, focus groups, and document review of the organizations themselves. And so when you think about a compliance culture always exists in a relationship. In other words, not just one party begins to do this. It in fact is a relationship. And if we reflect upon the question asked by the union leadership, that's a question really about to what extent is the way regulation taking place, and how does the way regulation take place impact the cultural aspects of the organization that's being regulated. And so we're really interested in the influence of CPU's own approaches and their own understanding of safety culture on the kind of compliance culture that we see within Sempra and Socalgas. And so we really recommend that CPU do their own self-assessment and investigation to understand better the specific kinds of effects that they're having on their behavior and the kinds of cultural aspects that we identify in Socalgas and Sempra. That it isn't just a one-sided thing, that in fact we look at this as a kind of reciprocal relationship, and that one cannot really change their behavior without the system itself being changed. And therefore CPUC has to understand itself as part of the system, and it needs to understand an investigation of itself and its own practices in terms of what it contributes to this larger system. And so we believe as a sense of guidance that CPUC needs to have its own independent assessment of its safety culture. It needs to establish its own shared understandings and beliefs in safety within its organization. And that understands that culture is a driver, that its own notion of self-safety culture is a driver not only of its own activities, but its own concept of safety culture impacts upon the licensees, and to understand that. And similar to the guidance that we gave to Sempra and Socalgas, we believe that CPUC needs to conduct externally facilitated dialogues around the concept of safety, to understand the concept itself, to understand how it becomes inculcated within the organization, so that it can be aligned within CPUC, within and across all its regulatory agencies. So it itself doesn't itself become siloed around safety culture, that it understands the various aspects of the ways in which it regulates, the various divisions itself has of regulation, how those reciprocally impact upon the organizations that are the licensees in this case. And so once it's aligned, then CPUC needs itself to engage in communication strategies collaboratively and cooperatively with Socalgas and Sempra. That is, so that these are not simply concepts passed back and forth with rules around them, that this now becomes grown as a kind of owned, shared understanding, and that the strategies that worked actually in face-to-face interactions have advantages over strategies that are independently arrived at and reported. So we're really looking at the ways in which they may cooperatively work together, how they may better benchmark with other industries in terms of what they have learned about how that relationship may facilitate a safety culture. And so that's the recommendations. And again, I'm hoping that this is not seen in some sense as a simple checklist. This is really seen as a kind of understanding about what kinds of activities and behaviors must be built on to develop the kind of shared cultural understanding that begins to address the kinds of areas in need of concern that we identified earlier. Thank you. And I think we're open to discussion now soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stan, and to the rest of the 2EC team. I will open it now to questions from our commissioners on the virtual dais. And I will start with you, Commissioner Rechtschaffen. Do you have any questions for the 2EC team?
Yeah, I'm a privileged guy today. That's the benefit of being the assigned commissioner. I have a couple of questions. And can you talk a little bit more about the extent to which Socalgas currently has a system for identifying near misses, potential threats, and maybe you could use that as a touchstone to talk about some of the other agencies that have really good near miss programs. I don't know, that's NASA or other agencies I know you guys are familiar with. That's the first question.
Sonia, do you want to take that? Because you've worked with the other regular agencies.
Thank you for the question. It's a very important one. To our observations and the assessment, Socalgas and Sempra do not have the type of reporting system that we have seen, for example, in the nuclear industry or the aviation industry, where near missing and low threshold reporting is something that can be done either by identification or anonymously. Socalgas does have some mechanism for anonymous reporting. However, this is not an expectation on the organization as it is in these other industries.
What's the first thing you said? It can be done anonymously or by identification. What does that mean?
In other words, in the other industries, we've seen examples of where there is an open reporting system and you can identify yourself when you report the issue. There are also avenues in which you can identify it anonymously in case you have any concerns.
Okay, Sonia, while you're on the hot seat, let me ask you to elaborate a little bit on a response you gave to me earlier and how it compares to one of the recommendations Stan just brought up. You said it's not reasonable, or it's not customary, or maybe even reasonable for a regulatory agency to expect excellence as opposed to compliance. And yet one of your core recommendations is that the PUC do its own internal safety culture assessment because of the influence that our approach to safety could have on the utilities. What I'm trying to sort through, that's an independent recommendation that has a lot of importance in its own right for everything else, and we're certainly gonna evaluate that very carefully. But what I'm trying to sort through is whether or not you guys are saying that we need to change our approach to our expectations of regulated entities, or how do we move the way we think about things in a way that achieves these broader more holistic goals for the utility. So I guess I'm asking you, Sonia, to respond and maybe think about how do we reconcile these two streams of thought?
Okay, we've thought about this. I've thought about this. I don't want to speak for the whole team. Maybe some other people have different ideas, but I say that the regulator cannot expect or regulate to excellence, basically, just because of the stakeholders involved and the way the regulations, and at least regulation, exists in this country. That doesn't mean that the regulator cannot be supportive and cannot facilitate and encourage a more proactive approach on the part of the utilities, and in some way in itself reward it for that behavior. It extends beyond compliance, and it extends for the regulator to get out of a compliance culture as well, because the culture right now in many regulated industries, by definition, is all that the regulator looks for, but not often as supportive, perhaps, in moving the licensees towards the performance and systemic view.
Stan or others, did you have any other thoughts at this question?
I would just add it's maybe a distinction between what we could call prescriptive regulation, where you're specifying exactly what to do, and maybe a slightly different approach in terms of maybe more goal-oriented regulation, and both can be combined. So I think the challenge a little bit about what the recommendations maybe that people were maybe expecting, I think Stan mentioned this at the beginning, was, being very specific list of recommendations that both the organization and you as a regulator could say, this recommendation was to provide training to your senior leadership team at Sempra, and have you done that? And they can say, yes, on the 25th of February, we gave them this training, and that sort of seems to meet a sort of compliance requirement. And the way we've written our recommendations are probably more goal-oriented, which describes what to do and what we want you to achieve. And I think that's sometimes the subtlety about maybe proposing excellence or expecting excellence rather than maybe prescribing it. You can prescribe compliance where you can say, do this specific thing. Doing that specific thing may or may not result in excellence. But what we are proposing, I suppose, is a little bit different in the sense that we're giving you, the recommendations are more what I would describe as goal-oriented in terms of we want an outcome. That's my take on it.
I get it. You're trying to prompt the discussion and move the dialogue in a different direction, so that we're not too prescriptive or not too detail-oriented, but we're focusing on the bigger systemic changes.
Yeah.
You don't want to make it easy by giving us recommendations that sound check the box or too detail-oriented. Of course, those are, I get that. Well, there may be a quick answer to my last question then, which is earlier you talked about the tendency to focus on lagging indicators, especially for personnel, and I'm wondering if you thought of, or if you have ideas for leading indicators that we should be considering, or more Socalgas and Sempra should be considering. Or Mark, does that fall into the category of things you don't want to do because you want the task to be focused on the broader changes?
I think I could start to answer, and then I will let the rest of the team to fill in. But our recommendations, as you see, Commissioner Rashoffer, is that we're trying to start from a shared and a different understanding about safety and about how safety relates to practice in the daily work for each of the organizations. And we believe that will be reached through a good dialogue, where it's a lot of listening and also sharing and being open and have that kind of conversations. And the leading indicators needs to be built on that shared understanding, because again, if we would provide a checklist, or if you will go and buy the checklist of leading indicators, it might not be the indicators that will help your specific organization or Socalgas specific organization. So this is something that needs to thrive from that dialogue and be tailored to the needs in that organization. So that's the point that we're trying to make, that the first step is to have that kind of dialogue, shared understanding, and then in a collaborative way, shape those tools, methods that will support an enhanced safety culture. Does it make sense?
Yes.
And anyone else in the team who wants to answer or add?
I just think it's very important that the organizations be engaged in that conversation, because otherwise there will not be ownership of those indicators or that process. So if we just give you, or if anybody just gives you the indicators and you haven't had the chance to understand them and to dialogue about them and to have some agreement on them, then the motivation to actually pursue them will not be there.
I think, though, it's important to be clear that that's not a soft recommendation, right? It's actually a much more difficult thing to do, and it's not that it's not without being able to be examined or tested by an external regulator. So the question that could be asked if this became a requirement would be, how, as an organization, are you tracking your performance outside of safety failures, right? So how do you know your system is safe? That's a very difficult question to answer without good leading indicators, right? So if someone tells you the answer to that question is, oh, we had X number of injuries or X number of gas leaks, that's not answering the question. They're telling you how they were unsafe in a specific way. What's really important is for an organization to be able to answer the question, how do you know how safe you are? And that requires, that is not an easy question to answer, and it requires a fair amount of internal dialogue and effort to identify those performance measures. So I'm suppose concerned a little bit that people might think the recommendations are soft, but they are not.
I don't think they're soft. I think they're very difficult. So those are two different things. But anyway, thank you for that feedback.
Thank you, Commissioner Rechtschaffen. We will take other questions from commissioners. President Reynolds, would you have any questions for the panel?
Sure, thank you, Carolina. I wanted to see if anyone would like to add any additional detail on this concept of personnel safety and looking more broadly at community safety and impacts on communities. And it relates to some extent to the question that we received at the beginning of the last segment. So first of all, when you think about, and maybe this is too much of, I'm trying to translate this into kind of concrete how this works. I understand the need for a different approach, and I think that the last comment about asking how your system is safe is really helpful for my understanding. So I appreciate that, but I'm still thinking through the translation of some of the concepts you're talking about to examples that the companies might be facing. So there might be some instances where protection, risk management for workers would be effective to protect communities. So you're protecting workers, you have mechanisms to do that, you have different measures in place, you're tracking your misses, and that will also keep the larger community protected adequately. But there are other circumstances where that's not going to be the case. And so I was wondering if you think about that differently? And then in particular, going back to the question about types of communities, it seems to me, and maybe this is too detailed, but it seems to me there would be a need to consider elderly and disabled residents, low-income residents, vulnerable residents, language issues when you're thinking about, when the companies are thinking about safety and risk management, and, you know, in particular for warnings or for field work when you're going out to communities. And so I was wondering if you had any detail to add about consideration of different types of communities in looking at that concept of, yes, we have worker protections, but we're also thinking about the larger community.
I don't think we really totally thought about it in that perspective. However, when we're talking about a healthy organizational safety culture of an organization, you would like to see emergency management and response incorporate those sectors of the population. You would like to see other high risk or threat areas incorporate and consider those parts of the population. And the problem that we encountered in this assessment was just even going back to the beginning to get Socalgas and Sempra Energy to be incorporating more of that comprehensive safety in all of those processes. So I think that part of the dialogue that has to happen in our recommendations is to incorporate and consider those types of populations and contingencies in whatever they do going forward. But our goal in this assessment was to understand, you know, how do they view safety, and is that the best way to view safety? And if not, then they need to come up with a better way to think about it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, President Reynolds. Commissioner Shiroma, do you have any questions for the 2EC team?
Yes, this question really back on the first part of the presentation, and that is, amongst the myriad of documents that you looked at, did you look at the governance documents? Whenever we've had a safety culture workshop on the various utilities over the last year or so, I have looked at the bylaws, the code of conduct, policy and position statements, and frequently, you know, the code of conduct for employees has a lot of safety emphasis. For contractors, some safety emphasis, but there's little to no emphasis for the executives. I mean, where you know, I'm one that you got to look at what is your governing documents. I mean, that is what you are held accountable to, and for the executives, the word safety doesn't even appear. Is that something that is important in terms of highlighting the emphasis of safety at the highest levels of governance?
So I don't know, I'm having a little bit of trouble. Did somebody else want to answer that? I didn't hear it all, but is it the governance that to have the consideration for safety through, is it the compensation for the highest executives, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, there's compensation certainly, but I mean, even in the code of conduct or in position policies and position statements, and you know, for example, you know, as I cruise through the Sempra website, there's stakeholder engagement, but it has to do with if you're going to construct something. I mean, it's not just an overriding safety value. Were these governance documents part of your evaluation, or should they be, so that it's right there in writing that safety, both inwardly and outwardly looking, is a core value?
We did review governance documents for Sempra. We asked those questions of the executives, and part of what we came away with consistently was just the focus on the personnel safety issues. But we did ask those directly, and yeah.
Okay. And are you able to point to a company that is kind of the gold standard of embracing what you have outlined here and successfully implementing it, or on their way to successfully implementing these principles?
We did conduct some briefings with them. They asked some very good questions, but we have not had an opportunity, to follow up on that. So.
Okay, and I was asking a separate question. Is there a company out there, a utility or an organization or what have you, or maybe it's a nuclear power plant, that is the gold standard in your view in embracing these principles that you've outlined here?
From my experience, there are some in a lot of experience in the nuclear industry, some, as I said, in the aviation industry. There are some, no company is going to succeed 100% in anything, but perhaps some of them are a little bit more balanced on the sheet with respect to the concept of safety.
And in tackling this, I definitely see the wisdom of you need to be very inclusive in discussing this, in fashioning next steps. There needs to be ownership. Is there any value in the regulated utilities comparing best practices among themselves?
Yes, and that varies by industry, depending upon, of course, how competitive they are. I imagine within California, the way the utilities are set up, that may not be an issue. I'm not that familiar with it, but when they're non-competitive that way, they will share industry information, and that's very useful.
And I remarked earlier, I used the word astounded about the key takeaway on ELISO was the communication, and I expressed surprise because I wondered, well, should the key takeaway have been what could have been done to prevent the releases in the first place? What could have been done to have troubleshooted that breakage, what have you? The nomenclature is, very engineering and specific, but what could have been done, even insofar as the sheer number of inspections and the knowledge, the mapping and so forth, as opposed to, our takeaways is we should have communicated better with the community. I come from elected office and for a utility, and the thing about running for office is you hear from your constituency and you hear from your voters what's important to them. I can walk in a grocery store and hear from the folks who I represented, about the highlights of safety, of environmentalism, of the pocketbook, and so forth. And there is that aspect of when you run for office, you are outward looking in terms of what the constituency has, and how do you bottle up some of that kind of attribute here to a regulated entity overseen by a regulator is my rhetorical question at this point. And I think you've provided some great insights. So that was not a question, that was just an observation. Back to you, Carlita.
Thank you, Commissioner Sharon. I do want to check with Commissioner Hauk. Commissioner Hauk, do you have any questions?
Yeah, just if you could elaborate a little more about the collaborative learning approach. You had recommended that the Commission, Sempra, and Socalgas sort of align around a broad concept of safety culture in this collaborative learning approach. And could you provide examples of other organizations or entities that have successfully implemented this collaborative approach?
Yes, and that was your question from before. I didn't want to forget that, right? Yeah, okay. Does somebody else want to, I mean, I'm happy to go, but somebody else I'm sure has some information.
I think you have most of the information because it was part of the the work that was done by IMPO and USNRC.
Okay, so you want me to do that? Okay. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission back in, oh boy, it was 2010, I think it was, or set about just to do this, and that was to hold public workshops with their stakeholders to understand, and this was after the Davis-Besse event, if you know that event, and they set about to try to come to some common and shared understanding of what safety culture is and what they should be looking at and concerned with, both on the licensee side, the industry side, and on the regulatory side. And over a period of about 2 years, they held a series of public meetings with all the stakeholders from all their licensees, which included not just nuclear plants, but hospitals, research facilities, and also with experts from universities and the communities, and tried to come up with this framework, which they ultimately did. And the interesting piece was that after the Davis-Besse event, the industry organization, INPO, Institute for Nuclear Power Organizations, the arm of the industry, the commercial side, had told all of the plants to conduct safety culture assessments, and nobody knew what that was. And so they ended up getting this incredibly useless data from all these different organizations because no one had given them a framework or a way in which to think about this. So as a result of that, they went forward, as I say, for about 2 years to conduct public workshops and come up with a framework, and for the industry and the regulator to embrace it both, which they have, and have implemented it quite successfully over the years. And then, as Monica knows, there's also international efforts to even harmonize in the nuclear industry, again, some commonality globally, not just within the United States. So, you know, I think there are examples out there. We recommended to the staff at the CPUC to look at, perhaps talk to some people in the nuclear industry. The aviation industry also has some good work done in this area. But I think in terms of the public and getting the stakeholders together, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission did a really outstanding job.
And maybe we also should share about CAST, the Commercial Aviation Safety Team that was created between the FIA, the regulatory body for aviation, together with the industry, and how they understood that we have a common goal to improve safety, and we can't do it just by enforcing more regulations. So we need another approach. So they started to have dialogues and collaboration and have enhanced, as you know, safety in a tremendous, successful way. So there is a lot to learn from that in the US, from that example. CAST, they call it the Commercial Aviation Safety Teams, that are having a dialogue and more of a collaborative approach how to enhance safety. It's another good example.
And in Canada, the Canadian Energy Regulator, which regulates sort of federal pipelines, those who go across provinces or internationally, again, hosted a number of public workshops with all stakeholders about safety culture to both inform their framework and have a discussion around expectations. I think the thing that was important about their process and about the nuclear process is that it engages all the stakeholders, right? I think sometimes if it's a regulator and the industry only in the room, it may be effective, but people can be, concerned about that process. So having it quite transparent and open more generally definitely was helpful within a Canadian context for some transparency for the process, and many interesting and very different perspectives come out. Some of the better metaphors that I use when I talk about safety culture actually come from some of the community stakeholders who attended those meetings. So that's just another example of practice.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And any thoughts or recommendations on how to better incorporate community input, I think are really appreciated.
Thank you, Commissioner Hauk. With no further questions from the virtual dais, I want to move on to questions that were submitted before the workshop on the recommendations. If we can please go to the slide, Joe, it will be before the slide that is currently showing. Oh, there we go. So just so you know, we tried to categorize these for Q&A 1 and Q&A 2. So this was the only one for Q&A 2 that we received. And part of this question, I think, has been answered to some extent by the discussion that we just had with the commissioners. But we're going to restate the second part, and I will highlight that. This question came from Socalgas, and it states, request that 2EC elaborate on recommendations and next steps and whether they have observed particularly effective enhancements and responses from other companies they have assessed. So I think that sounds like Socalgas would like you to elaborate on your recommendations, perhaps aimed at them, and provide those examples of effective enhancements that you've seen in your experience and the responses from other companies you have assessed. Over to you, Monica.
I give it over to Sonia.
Okay. So I think that we did point out, Carolina, elaborate on the recommendations and the ideas behind them and the next steps. There is a logic to what we've put out and presented on the slides and what Stan spoke about. And there are examples of effective enhancements and responses from other companies. But again, this has to be done within the organization itself because not one size fits all. And so, but I can say, I think we've all had the experience that by using a independent or a standardized assessment methodology to see where you are, one sure way after you do some enhancements and interventions is to, again, monitor those changes through similar types of approaches so that you can, in fact, see where your organization is moving. And that has been done in several organizations as follow-up during the improvement period. So we can't sit here and talk about, that you should do X, Y, and Z, that will be effective for you because every organization's culture is different and that will require different types of improvements. We can give guidance, we can give ideas, but I think the enhancement has to be imposed by the organization itself.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm not sure if anybody else from the team wants to elaborate. Sounds good. We will then move on to verbal questions. And just to do a time check, we are ahead of schedule. And as you've noticed, we've skipped our break. And this is just based on the fact that we were, 30 to 40 minutes ahead of schedule. So we can see about taking that break after our Q&A session. So we will move to verbal questions. Again, WebEx participants should click on the raise your hand icon in the participants menu on the lower right-hand corner. Phone participants should unmute phones and dial *3 and listen out for the 6 digits of your phone. A reminder that if you have public and formal comments, there will be the time for that towards the end of today's agenda. So with that, we want to see who we have on the line. IT host, could you please unmute Melissa and let her know that she is able to ask her question?
Good afternoon, Melissa Kasnitz. Oh, and you are unmuted.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Thank you. I'm Melissa Kasnitz. I'm the legal director at the Center for Accessible Technology, and I submitted the question previously about looking out for particularly vulnerable populations when considering public safety. President Reynolds followed up on that question as well, which I really appreciate. Thank you. But I was hoping to get a little bit more understanding. I understood your response to say that entities should consider everyone when they're considering public safety so that there's no need to single out the most vulnerable populations. And then I think you say in response to President Reynolds that you would recommend that in working to integrate with emergency response expertise, you would include in future dialogue that vulnerable populations should be considered separately going forward. I guess I'm looking for a more clear understanding of what you would recommend going forward in terms of looking out for particularly vulnerable populations when an entity is trying to include considerations of public safety at large.
Okay, thank you for the question, and I'm sorry if it wasn't clear the first 2 times around. Let me try one more time.
Thank you.
I think that the first part of the response was that when we say and discuss public safety, it is all-encompassing to begin with, that we are not in any way dividing or looking at certain parts of the population separately. The second part was that when Socalgas and Sempra have these dialogues, Socalgas probably in particular, have these dialogues around coming up with a shared understanding of a comprehensive view of safety that will and should include public safety, then it is really up to that organization. You would like to see, and you would hope that they would specifically identify those sectors of the population that need different or special consideration in their development of their plan or process. So the first step is to get them to have this more robust concept of safety, which will include dialogue around public safety. In the dialogue of public safety, they will have to identify what that means, what aspects of their work do they need to really look at that are the highest, not just the highest, but those aspects of public safety that are important to them and their organization. And then once they do that, they can look at how the different sectors in the population, such as those individuals with disabilities or whatever they might be, will need to be addressed in their own and most responsive way. But in our assessment, this is a process, and they need to go from the big picture to the identification of where they're going. And then once they do that, it will be easier for them to account and to be able to be mindful of those different members of the population. Is that clearer?
I think so, but I guess I would encourage you and all of the folks who are making recommendations to be clear from the get-go that a standard of public safety that looks out for the public in general actually is not going to be adequate to protect those people who are most vulnerable. And so it seems that if you start with that, look out for everyone, with no consideration of individuals with heightened needs, you're going to delay recognition of the fact that there are some people who need more assistance than standard in order to be protected at a comparable level. And so I would like to encourage anyone making recommendations and anyone thinking about this to have that perspective from the start. Otherwise, it's a different example, but we've seen in the realm of power shutoffs and de-energization steps that are first considered to be adequate to support the needs of the public at large are found not to help the people who have the highest needs. And then there's a scramble after the fact to try to look out for the most vulnerable folks. And that, to me, is the opposite order that it should be in. The perspective should be to look out for the most vulnerable first, not as an afterthought.
So noted. Fair point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kasnitz. We have another question, and IT host, would you please unmute Mr. Matt Epuna? Mr. Epuna, please go ahead. I think you, oh, just one moment. I think you've not been unmuted yet. There we go. I think you're unmuted now. Mr. Epuna, would you like to ask?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And I especially want to thank the panel that have done the assessment and prepared the report. Fantastic job. Thank you for everything you did on this. My question is, are there examples that you can share with us pertaining to the influence or impact that the regulators may have had on the operators? Whether positive or negative, any impact or influence that we may have had on the operator.
I don't think we can give you specific examples of that. With respect to, maybe I missed which incident?
I think Mr. Epuna is muted again, but I may restate while our IT host unmutes him again. I think his question is around impact of regulators, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, around safety culture. So I'm not sure if you have examples of a specific incident or if it's in general with safety culture.
Oh, okay. I thought he was talking about a particular.
He may clarify now. Mr. Epuna, do you want to clarify?
Thank you, Carolina. Yes, you stated it properly. My question is general, not specifically on any particular incident. General, I want to know if you can share with us any example that our influence as regulator may have had on the operator, whether positive or negative.
Oh, we do have a couple that we can give. Some from our own experience that we were involved with. I will give one from the nuclear industry, which was the Davis-Besse event, where nuclear power plant came very close to having a hole in the reactor head, which would have been an incredible disaster. My point about the regulator, though, is that the US NRC at that time was not diligent in overseeing some of the memos and orders and recommendations that it gave to the industry. And consequently, the licensee did not perceive it as a requirement, did not feel they had to comply with the recommendations. So they did not do the inspections of the reactor head that they should have. And that ultimately led to further deterioration without the regulator involvement. That's one very clear example of a negative influence where I know that the US NRC has learned a lesson. I don't know if anybody else on the team wants to give another example, but.
And there are other examples also, both positive and negative from the nuclear. And in general, that has been more focus on in the nuclear about the regulatory role in influencing the safety culture of the licensee or the utilities that they regulate. And quite much work have been done. There is also a publication, if you are interested, I could put it in the chat later, from the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency, which gives a framework for regulators, how they can foster a positive regulatory safety culture that will have a good influence on the utilities. A good example from also nuclear is that the regulator in some countries have been fostering these dialogues that we have talked about here today, and have in that sense been very clear about the different roles, but also been looking at the joint common goal to enhance safety, and have in that sense had a good shared understanding and openness about both the obstacles and the problems in evolving the culture, and also being able to overcome those through those dialogues. But it needs then to have that trust relationships, but still have the independencies of the two different roles that the licensee or the operator have and the regulator, because otherwise you could come into almost a groupthink where you are all thinking the same, and that could be tremendously harmful. So you need also to be careful for that side. So you're not in the regulatory capture, so to speak, that or in the knee of the operator. So it could be on that side too. So it's important to respect the different roles, and that the regulator always have the legal role to oversee the operator. But I will put in the chat this document that I just mentioned. I think it gives some inspiration, at least. I don't know if Mark, if you have anything you want to share from examples of
No, I
other
think those
industries.
examples are great.
Mm.
Thank you, TUEC. We will move to our next question. Mr. Obiora, our IT host, would you please unmute Mr. Noel Obiora?
Can you hear me?
You have been unmuted now, Mr. Obiora. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. The examples TUEC have given with respect to collaborative learning and regulators have been very helpful. Given your vast experience in this area and the different areas and countries you've worked on, and different parts of the state country you've worked on, what would be your best example of an electric or gas utility that has done a good job of implementing some of these recommendations that you're making? You know, what would be your can you mention some gas or electric utilities that are public monopolies that have done a good job of having some of these recommendations implemented as part of their safety culture.
I think we all have opinions. It also fluctuates over time. So somebody who you may have thought was good at one point in time, there is a cycle because sometimes they really haven't changed the culture. It has not been internalized. So you see different stages, as we talked about before. So it depends on what you are defining as your healthy safety culture. I mean, the recommendations, the type of behaviors we spoke about, I think we have seen examples of that. Again, the outcome measures can vary and the effectiveness varies depending upon how the organization implements that.
I think in this, for me at least, in this type of forum, I would be quite reluctant to start listing companies that I've worked with and the changes that they have made. So what I appreciate the question, it's something I'd be quite nervous about asking, or in this sort of forum to be able to sort of point to them. But I think if you look at industries, which is a bit easier, there has been a very successful transition or uptake in the nuclear industry in the US that has been quite effective. And I think in aviation as well, there's been some very good examples of taking these issues on board and moving forward. So that's probably what I would point and direct it to. And I would also say that within the gas, say, distribution business in North America, you know, there are a number of organizations who are grappling with these issues as we go forward. And I think all of them probably have something to learn from each other. I wouldn't point to any one particular US gas company, say, oh, they've really got a good job. I would say all of the larger gas distribution companies are struggling with the same issues. Some are better at some parts than others. So I would encourage them to learn from each other in a sort of what Edgar Schein would call a sort of humble inquiry, as this is what I'm trying to do. What are you trying to do? So I wouldn't point to anyone in particular for a range of reasons.
Thank you, Tuisi, for your useful and very helpful insights. We do not seem to have any additional questions on the line. So I think this is probably a good time to take a quick stretch break. So why don't we take a 15-minute break and come back at, let's say, 3:10. So we will resume our activities with the next steps and be close to ending our workshop today. So thank you, everybody, and we will see you at 3:10. Need a little more circulation. Thank you. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So after a little breather, let's move on to ALJ Klein, who will tell us a little bit about the next steps. ALJ Klein, moving on to you.
Thank you, Carolina. And before I start, I'd also like to mention that I've heard Cal Advocate's inquiry about getting additional information that's background to the report, and I'll consider whether specific guidance will be required by ALJ ruling. As far as other next steps in this proceeding, written comments will be due on February 14th. In the next few weeks, I will issue a ruling that will set a pre-hearing conference, and that will be sometime in March. Parties may may file pre-hearing conference statements by February 28th. Thank you, Carolina.
Thank you, ALJ Klein. I want to move on now to the final portion of our agenda, which are the informal public comments. So as a reminder, WebEx participants should click on the raise your hand icon in the participants menu on the lower right-hand corner. Phone participants should unmute phones and dial *3 and listen out for the first 6 digits of your phone for your turn. Spanish language participants listening by phone who wish to make a public comment can unmute their phones and dial *1, which will alert our operator and interpreter. When the interpreter prompts you, please provide your comment 1 sentence at a time so your comment can be translated into English. Spanish speakers will be allocated extra time for translation of their comments. Technical host, will you please unmute the first public comment?
Good afternoon. I see nobody in the public comment queue.
Okay, maybe we are going to give just 1 more minute to get everybody lined up. Okay, I think we have somebody now. Joe, would you be able to unmute our first public commenter?
Commenter Meshkati, your line is unmuted.
Thank you very much. This is Najm Meshkati. I'm a professor of civil environmental engineering and industrial and systems engineering at the University of Southern California, down the road from you in Los Angeles. As a resident of Los Angeles and a person who have been observing operation at Southern California Gas Company and California Public Utilities Commission for the last 40 years, I would like to commend CPUC for this great study. I think this is marvelous. This is particularly, I hope that President Alice Reynolds is here to hear that. It has been a sea change for CPUC since the time of San Bruno accident that we considered CPUC as a captured regulator. Kudos to CPUC and kudos to 2EC and the colleagues that they did this beautiful report. I have one question, and that question refers to the recommendation that this team, great team, they did on page 50 of the report about CPUC. There is a line over there that CPUC promoted the utilities' reactive rather than proactive behavior. They meant basically they promoted Southern California Gas Company's reactive rather than proactive behavior. And they said that CPUC needs to change its behavior to be a little bit more proactive. In light of this recommendation, I would like to ask or point the attention to the safety culture review, which was done for CPUC by a company called North Star in 2019. Again, I've been teaching this area. I have been a little familiar with Aliso Canyon situation because I was a member of the advisory board and steering panel of California Council of Science and Technology that produced that report about Aliso Canyon. And here is my question. If this is a safety culture review with this depth, with this fantastic methodology, with that way that they integrated the different data, if we use this as a standard, then as a professor, I give the study which was done on PG&E an incomplete. And I would like to ask the CPUC to open up another investigation, another independent safety review of PG&E and Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, specifically in light of the recent chatter and discussion about extending Diablo's life beyond 2025. There is a wealth of information in Diablo Canyon, which is being gathered by Diablo Canyon Independent Safety Committee that was created after the settlement agreement of 1988. I love to see this great team, Dr. Sonia Haber, Dr. Monica Hatt, to look at those documents the same way that they looked at these 346 or 437 documents as part of the Appendix D of this. Again, kudos to CPUC, kudos to this great team. And why don't you repeat the same study for PG&E and Diablo Canyon? That's even more important. That's a nuclear power plant. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muscati. IT host, would you be able to unmute the next attendee that would like to provide a public comment?
I actually observed no more attendees wishing to make public comment.
Thank you. At this moment, we will move on to our Spanish line just to confirm. Claudia, do we have anyone on the Spanish line? I am getting a message that we do not have anybody on the Spanish line at the moment. So with no more further comments, this public comment period is closed. Thank you to all those who provided comments, Mr. Muscati. To provide formal written comments, please submit them online through the proceeding docket. The link can be found in today's agenda. If you need assistance, please contact the Public Advisor's Office at public.advisor@cpuc.ca.gov. I will now turn it over to Commissioner Rechtschaffen for closing remarks.
Thank you, Carolina. I want to thank you again for your exceptional work in organizing this workshop and in all the work leading up to it. I want to thank everyone from 2EC who've been working with us and reiterate how difficult and impressive it's been that they've completed this study and report in the face of an unprecedented pandemic. There's a tremendous amount of rich material here that we need to think about that will inform our processes going forward. I appreciate a lot of the back and forth and the dialogue and your answers about specific things we should look at and examples to use while resisting the temptation to dot the I's and cross the T's, because that's inconsistent with how you want us to change our approach and how you think Socalgas and Sempra should change their approaches. But at bottom, it's an excellent report. It's very much in line with what we've been trying to do at the PUC over the past decade, which is to make safety a paramount consideration and imbue it in all activities that we regulate and all the activities that our regulated utilities are involved in. So there's much to think about for us going forward. Thank you very much to everyone who joined today and participated.
Thank you, Commissioner Rechtschaffen. Would any other commissioners have any closing remarks to share with us today?
Yes, I'll go next, Carolina. Thank you for a great job emceeing today's discussion. Commissioner Rechtschaffen and Judge Klein, and teeing this up for this workshop, to TEC for your in-depth work, and to Sempra and Socalgas for really making themselves available and their documents available, their contractors available to go through this assessment, to ready to take a hard look at themselves, and also for the recommendations to us, to the CPUC, in terms of our role going forward. What else can we do to really provide for an environment and a roadmap to success in increasing inward and outward looking safety, really looking at how can we be better partners with the public. So thank you. I look forward to seeing what's next in the proceeding, Commissioner Rechtschaffen. I look forward to working with all on the path forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Sharoma. With no further remarks, please go ahead, Commissioner Houck.
Thank you, Carolina. I just also wanted to thank you, Judge Klein, safety policy staff, and especially Commissioner Rechtschaffen for taking the lead on this. A lot of really important information. I agree, it's a great report. It gives us a lot to think about, and I'm really pleased to see that we're moving forward with this discussion in such depth. And so I also look forward to seeing what's next and following our next steps on and continuing the discussion. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. I also want to recognize 2EC. I want to point out to everybody attending that Monica is in Sweden and it's currently closer to 1 a.m. her time. So I commend you for staying up and being engaged with today's discussion. I appreciate all the insights you have shared and your experience, and I really appreciate our leadership at the Commission for being here to listen and learn from the external parties that we've engaged, and we have all learning process for us as well. So I appreciate everybody, and I appreciate all our attendees for being engaged as well and asking the questions. So with that, we will be making the slides available and recording available as well. Please check back on the Safety, Culture, and Governance sections page of the CPUC's website. I have shared that link on our chat. And any questions, feel free to email myself. If we could go to that slide, Joe, so that people have my email address, I would appreciate that. I will share it on the chat just in case. But anyway, thanks everybody. And with that, I think we conclude today's workshop. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to share our comments and to support our report, and for this opportunity to do this assessment. I think it's been a very interesting process. Nice to see everyone. Sadly, never got to go to California to do any of the data collection, but maybe sometime in the future I'll get to go there.
Thanks, Mark. We missed you out here. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for the engagement, and thank you for a good facilitation, Carolina. And thank you for all the collaboration. Thank you. I wish you
Thank you for staying awake.
Yeah, thank you for have a good night's sleep now, Monica.
I will. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you the best of success in your further steps in safety culture.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, 2EC team. We will be in touch soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.